Okay, we are live. Hope everyone is doing well. I have with me the Oracle of London, Mr. Alexander McCurson. I have with me the one, the only, the great, Mr. Robert Barnes. Robert, how are you doing today? Where can people find you?
Good. And people can find me at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
All right. One sec. Let me just fix up something. Okay, we are good. I think the locals chat is working just real quick, but I'm trying to fix it up. And when I fix that up for the locals chat, I don't know if people in locals can chat. I can't see it, but I'll try to fix that up. Welcome to everybody that's watching us on Odyssey, on Rumble, on YouTube, and hopefully on locals. Hopefully on locals.
It's probably
Let's
live.
just,
Sometimes you
yeah,
check
no,
your phone.
yeah, I'm sure it's
It does
live.
that
I
on.
just can't.
That happens to me all the time.
Okay.
For some reason, the web browser, I can't see the chat, but I can always
That's
see
what
it on
I'm
my
experiencing.
phone. So
Okay, that's what I'm experiencing. Okay, great. So I'm sure everyone on locals is plugged in as well. Thank you to our moderators. We have a lot of news to get to. So we'll go for a couple of hours. Whatever super chats we can't get to, we will answer in a follow-up show. But there is one super chat. Alexander, before I pass it off to you and Robert, there is one super chat that came in before the show started. It's from Bleaky. And of course, it has to do with the U.S. Supreme Court rules. New York concealed firearms restriction violates Second Amendment. That is the big topic that we'll jump right into. So, Alexander, Robert, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Can I just say this is a point I want to emphasize to our American viewers. The Supreme Court of the United States is the single most important court in the world. Its decisions are followed everywhere by lawyers, everybody who is a jurist of any standing, not just in Britain, not just in common law jurisdictions, even in civil jurisdictions, that's to say European type jurisdictions. Everybody follows what the Supreme Court does. And there's two reasons for this. One is obviously because the United States is the United States, and the High Court of the United States is a court which we're going to always be interested in because of the power of the United States. But secondly, because it is the first constitutional court ever created. No other country ever created a constitutional court before. No other country has ever had a constitution like that of the United States. And that means that constitutional lawyers everywhere look to the Supreme Court of the United States to determine constitutional issues. And that has enormous influence. Now, I can give examples of this. I mean, we hear an awful lot, for example, about the European Convention on Human Rights. It's often said that this was British inspired. It's British inspired, looking at the development of human rights law as the English understood it or misunderstood it in the United States, without actually importing directly American ideas. American ideas are all over it. So everybody in the legal community is incredibly excited about these decisions that are coming out of the United States Supreme Court. We are very frustrated that we were promised some today, which don't seem to have come. But I think we've had a big one, a very important one. And Robert Barnes is the man to tell us all about it and what it means.
Yeah, so this was the last scheduled calendar day for the Supreme Court to issue any opinions for this term. Each term is kind of usually starts in October of the prior calendar year. So October 2021 through May 2022, with the term usually wrapping up by writing and issuing a bunch of published opinions by the end of June. Now, the Supreme Court had issued that the only day it had left on its calendar before its summer break was today. So the assumption, usually that means they will issue all their opinions on that. Sometimes those opinions will get delayed for, sometimes they will issue decisions as late as the first week of July. But that's usually the latest they go. They had several big cases that had not issued opinions yet that people were really sitting on. earlier this week, they only issued a school decision about the right of freedom of religious expression. Means that the state is supposed to be neutral on religion both ways, neutral and not favoring a specific religion, but also neutral and not discriminating against a religious expression. And so that decision was a good decision on the Maine school system. But the big ones today, no abortion decision actually published, no big EPA decision actually published, no big decision on school prayer issues about prayer after school in this particular context. But they did issue one of the other big ones, which was the Second Amendment case. And this is New York's concealed and carry law and the way in which it restricts and regulates gun rights in New York. And the law had a twofold significance. One was the specific issue of concealed and carry rights across the country and whether various state laws attempting to prohibit that were constitutional. And this goes back to whether the Second Amendment is limited to the home. For those that are out there, the Second Amendment that may not be very familiar with U.S. law, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments added to the U.S. Constitution, which is a precondition for a bunch of people approving the Constitution's change from the original Articles of Confederation, included a Second Amendment, which was the right to keep and bear arms. It was, as Justice Scalia said, and I think this correctly reflects its history, a right of self-defense. Or another way to think of it is empowering the individual against the state and against others. In other words, does the state have a complete monopoly on both the legal right of violence as well as the certain means of violence, certain tools of violence? As a practical matter, the state has the latter these days in terms of nuclear weapons and things like that. But the goal was that the state would not have a legal monopoly on the right of violence, nor on the means of violence, and that the ordinary individual's right in America would be protected by their individual right to keep and bear arms. The lower courts had been trying to limit this. The U.S. Supreme Court famously in Heller said, yes, there's a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. That's an individual right. There was language in the Second Amendment that talked about protecting a militia. Now, the idea was there wouldn't be a national standing army. Kind of ironic and bridges into our current issues and conversation, but there wouldn't be. Don't worry, anybody. We're not going to have a direct national tax system, and don't worry, we're never going to have a direct national standing army. Neither one of those promises turned out all that great. But one of the ways in which instead if you wanted to have an army, you had to call upon the militia. As a practical matter, what it did is it provided a political check on the abuse of power. Because there was no professional standing army, you would have to resort to the appeal to the ordinary person at the local level. And it sort of democratized military foreign policy potentially and domestic, quote unquote, insurrection policy, because if they wouldn't participate, you had nobody to go to. I mean, anybody who studied the whole history of governments and societies around the world know how important it is in terms of power, whether there's a national standing army or not. That was part of the reason for the militia. But it was all about a general political, philosophical purpose of empowering the individual against the state. Or as a reflection and expression of the state, the individual held the power to keep and bear arms, not the centralized power of the state and a professional army. The professional army part, that ship has sailed for some time. The courts kind of ignored that. But they finally restored the Second Amendment right in the Heller case. But then the question is it limited to the home? Or do you have a right of self-defense wherever you go? Do you have a right to keep and bear arms, regardless of whether you're in your home, in your business, in your car, on the street, traveling between states, et cetera? And that's what the concealed and carry issue was more broadly about. And what the U.S. Supreme Court decided today, a decision issued 6-3, written by the one and only Justice Thomas, who has once again saved Republicans from their own self-inflicted political wounds, because just this week they also are about to pass a major gun control law that has a lot of the Republican base, the populist Trumpist wing of the base, very unhappy. Now Justice Thomas's opinion is going to make them twice as happy, so that will limit the political damage of the mistake of Senate Republicans going along with a gun control proposal after the mass shooting incident in Texas at a school called Uvalde. The Supreme Court actually referenced the issues concerning the Buffalo mass shooting actually that occurred. So the net effect of the decision is that they have expanded. They've said the New York law is unconstitutional. that they've expanded the Second Amendment right to be outside the context of the home, that it applies in the concealed and carry and other contexts. Not only that, they wrote the opinion in such a way that the big issue was how to analyze gun laws, gun control laws, gun limiting, gun restricting laws. And right now, in the past, prior to this decision, it was kind of confused, and often they provided a lot of discretion to the states, particularly here in the Ninth Circuit out west. They had really allowed the states to do a lot of limitations on guns using a deferential standard of review. They have also modified that, so the standard of review is no longer near as deferential. So it is the most, I mean, other than Heller itself, the biggest Second Amendment decision issued today is the biggest Second Amendment decision issued by the U.S. Supreme Court in history, in American history. And as you note, these kind of cases, the right of self-defense, while some of these issues are specific and unique to the United States textual language in the Second Amendment, it reflects a broader principle, a broader premise that will be applicable in analogous context around the globe about what the right of self-defense is more broadly, and empowering the individual as opposed to the state, which is the philosophical principle this is. And it's a massive win for those of us that have a robust view of the Second Amendment.
Can I just make a few historical observations about this? Because one of the things I have always tried to get people in Britain to understand, and I also should say people in the United States, is that the United States is the creation of a revolution. And the Constitution of the United States, in the context of the world that the United States rebelled against, is a profoundly revolutionary document. In 18th century England, the right to bear arms was limited. For example, if you carried a sword, you had to be a gentleman. In other words, you had to be a member of the aristocracy and of the class just below the aristocracy, which was the gentry, the people who owned the land, who in effect controlled English society at that time. If you did not belong to those classes, carrying a sword was actually something that could get you into very serious trouble. It was something that, the society at that time in England was deeply skeptical about. Not just skeptical about, it was dangerous to do. It was not exactly illegal, but effectively illegal. And not just this, but of course, if we're talking about standing armies, kings in Europe had standing armies. And of course, England again is a monarchy. The standing army is operated by the aristocracy. The aristocracy are in charge of the courts. We have justices of the peace, who are, of course, at that time drawn from the landed families, the same people who were entitled to bear arms, and they control the judiciary, they control the military, and as a result, that effectively meant you had a certain control of society. So coming along and saying everybody has a right to bear arms, and everybody has a right to constitute themselves in a militia, is a revolutionary act. It means that the power of elites is challenged. It's challenged head on. And of course, if you're talking about the right to self-defense, well, again, if only some people are entitled to bear arms and not others, which is the situation in 18th century England, that's a pretty radical thing to entrench in your constitution as well. So we're talking about a revolutionary document, and we have, I suspect, in the United States, people who are not happy with that and who've been trying to chip away at it steadily and systematically over the decades, the centuries since it was created. And I think this has accelerated a lot in recent years. And that probably reflects, if I can say, the Anglicization of a part of the American elite, which we've discussed in many places, in many programs before. So I just wanted to give that context, because I think people don't fully understand the revolutionary implications of this going backwards, and also quite why there is this attachment in the United States, which to the right to bear arms. I think it is one that perhaps people in the United States, it's passed down, it's passed through. It may not be always understood or explained in the way that I have just done, but people in the United States are profoundly attached to it because of that history, which explains its democratic importance. It is something that people in the United States see as both empowering and also at the same time as a defense against overweening governmental power. Now, tell us a little bit about what the opposition is all about. Why are the people who want to restrict this right in the United States? Why are they trying to reinterpret the Constitution in this way? Why are they trying to chip away at the Second Amendment? And who is it that's coming from it? I mean, I get the impression that President Biden is keen to reduce this right as far as possible. Obama, the same. I mean, what is the rationale for chipping it away? And what are the legal arguments that are adopted in trying to do it?
So it's sort of a bifurcated aspect. What they share in common, the people who oppose an expansive, robust Second Amendment, is that they're fundamentally statist. And so they're people who believe the state should have a monopoly on certain kinds of power, that the individual should not have the right even of self-defense in certain contexts. This was the debate in the Rittenhouse case in part in terms of the court of public opinion. These are, they tend to be politically selective when they say they want the right of self-defense, but they're people who fundamentally think the state should have a monopoly on the right to use violence and don't want the individual to be able to have that. And the other attribute of it is the people who truly believe that the right of self-defense and the popularity of guns is the reason for certain gun violence in the United States. And in recent time, that has been focused on mass shooting events, whether it's particularly school shootings since Columbine, but other events that have taken place. And those that have studied it in detail, including people at liberal organizations like 538, a guy that was at PBS, another guy who was at NPR, who've all written that when you study it in great detail, restrictions on guns, access to guns, use of guns, does not correspond or correlate to reduced gun violence. That gun violence is almost everyone who commits illegal gun violence does so illegally in the sense that they not only obviously they're committing a crime in the process, but usually their gun is purchased illegally. So that it's not that creating a big black market for guns, which is what a lot of their practical effects of their proposals would be, would not in fact bring about a reduced, just ask Mexico. Mexico has lots of gun control laws, hasn't stopped the cartels much. So there's really no, in fact, globally, there's not much correlation between limits on gun rights and limits on gun violence. And so you have different cultures that have used guns more or less. I mean, for example, in the UK, much lower history of using guns and violence. Now, that doesn't stop like knives and a lot of other things from being used. But usually that is a stronger predictor or correlator to gun violence than is lawful right of access to guns. So it's a mixture of two groups, people who I think have a mistaken belief that it's like anything that people want to ban. It's like, whether it's drugs or alcohol, historically, if something is pretty easy to make, pretty easy to transport, pretty easy to sell, people will get their hands on it if they want it. The reason why a lot of people have illegally owned guns that are engaged in crime is they don't want to track and trace back to them. So I mean, this is kind of common sense. And it just creates a black market that enhances additional problems. Any attempt to regulate something that's popular and desired and easily accessible has really never been successful. Our regulatory efforts on alcohol in the 1920s helped birth the American mob's power in the United States. Our attempts to control drugs has only birthed all kinds of drug dealer wealth and drug cartels around the world. It hasn't worked. We haven't restricted at all the actual use of drugs, and even the illegal drugs. And then on top of that, gun control hasn't shown much. I mean, Chicago has some of the strictest gun laws in the world. They also have some of the highest gun violence in the world. I mean, it just doesn't really correlate. So that's where part of it is. Part of it is people who want to say the Second Amendment is only for a militia, and the militia should be controlled by either Congress or the governor, and therefore your gun rights are really contingent on whether Congress or the governor thinks you should have them. That kind of Second Amendment interpretation. They would take the militia clause as a limiting clause on the plain language that says the right to keep and bear arms. It doesn't really mean right to keep and bear arms, according to this liberal legal analysis. But I think so. That's the legal argument is a limitation on the Second Amendment as not being an individual right to keep and bear arms. And the political argument is guns are bad, leads to gun violence. And hey, we don't want the ordinary person to have guns, do we? And, Bowling for Columbine, Michael Moore's movie where he talks to people, that was his whole pitch. And part of the pitch also was what arms fit within that. I mean, historically, in the United States, a cannon actually fit within the Second Amendment. And sometimes people say, oh, it's not like you could have a cannon or a bazooka or whatever. It's like, actually, yes. Back then you could. It was part of the ability of a ship to defend itself was considered included within the Second Amendment. But obviously, it's not practical for it to apply to, like, nuclear weapons, right? So that's where the question becomes we live in a different era in terms of armaments and munitions and military violent capability. We have weapons unimaginable at the time of the Second Amendment. The philosophical principle would be that would continue to protect the individual. What weapon is necessary to protect them? Certain mass offensive weapons would not be needed to protect them. But that's where some debate takes place. But practically speaking, the Supreme Court has never extended it that far to just any kind of weapon system. It's still something practical and useful in day-to-day life, usually a gun.
But you have extensive jurisprudence about this. You have precedents which have interpreted, presumably, the Second Amendment going back into the 19th century. And of course, the point to understand about this is that judicial interpretation, particularly at the level of the Supreme Court, is intended to be authoritative and sometimes binding. So if the Second Amendment is interpreted consistently to mean a certain thing, that there is a right to bear arms, then it's rather, I think, shall we say, wrong for people who are not part of that process of judicial interpretation to try to limit and reconstruct that interpretation, in that the meaning of that provision in a more narrow way than the Supreme Court has historically done. Is that correct? I mean, do you have that history of precedents that sort of build and explain the Second Amendment going way back into its origins?
From a historical perspective, yes. From a Supreme Court perspective, not so much. Right. Because the U.S. Supreme Court never, now you could argue, didn't really have cause to do so. There was cause to do so, in my view, historically, but they played games about what they did. So I was recently on vacation in New Orleans and went on a tour with a guy I would say comes from a sort of black nationalist, black populist combined tradition in Louisiana, which is kind of unique to Louisiana, but also very robust. Huey P. Newton, founder of the Black Panthers in America. He is named after Huey P. Long, the great populist governor of Louisiana, because his mama was a big fan. So you have some unusual, like everything in New Orleans and Louisiana, you got some unusual overlaps. But he was talking about, he kept coming back over and over again to one of the key restrictions on freed blacks in New Orleans and Louisiana was the inability to keep and bear arms. There were the restriction on gun rights as critical and essential to the ability of the French to oppress their individual liberty aspirations and ambitions. And so so in that sense, politically, historically, there's a robust historical understanding of what this meant to the ordinary person and how it could be misused and abused if not enforced. But the U.S. Supreme Court kind of dodged the issue. Heller was really the first major Second Amendment decision of its kind. And that was just about a decade or so ago. So so in that sense, we don't have a robust Supreme Court interpretation of a lot of precedents on the Second Amendment. We do have a pretty broad, clear public understanding of what it meant philosophically to the founders. And I include often there's a mistaken elite-based focus on what the Constitution means when people say founders. They often mean somebody who was sitting in the hall, somebody who was sitting in the halls of Congress. My view of founders is, I mean, the founding generation, the people who fought in the wars, the people who who voted on the Constitution, the people who voted, the people who are publicly participating. Now, that had certain legal exclusions at the time, but it was still one of the broadest public participations. And that's all the Barneses in Rhode Island originally voted against the Constitution because it did not have a Bill of Rights to it. Like, no thanks. In Rhode Island, we tried to hold out on currency, right? The right to print our own currency and some other stuff. And then they sent in that army that they said they weren't going to have. And, he said, okay, never mind. We'll come back to that later. But so that, for the founding generation, this is what the Second Amendment meant. The two great worries was a national standing army, and a way of reflecting that was we do not have a legal monopoly on the power and tools of violence in the centralized state. It is I, as an individual's natural right to do so, and it is a critical, essential, fundamental restriction on the misconduct of the state, as we've witnessed ever since we've had a professional standing army, quite frankly, in terms of our foreign policy especially. So, but yeah, the Supreme Court precedents are thin on this, and that's why it was an area they really needed to go to the historical original understanding and enforce it in plain language. They got part of the way with Heller. They got the rest of the way today.
And tell us about the Supreme Court decision now. Who was in favor and who was against? I say that because it was a 6-3 decision. Who were the three who were against? Obviously, the three liberals. Yes. But what was their argument? What was their point? I mean, what argument were they making?
The three liberals have long held that the Second Amendment does not give an individual person the right to keep and bear arms. So they still hold that position, that the Second Amendment is just a militia empowerment provision, and which, by the way, makes no sense why you'd have you don't need an amendment to the Constitution to deal with how you're going to arm a militia. I mean, it's historically kind of a ludicrous argument. But it's because they have a first phrase that's connected to the second phrase, but the first phrase is not limiting on the second, or otherwise there's a waste of space in the second in the Bill of Rights. But they still hold to that position. And so, and now they also wanted to keep what other limits were there. Limits in terms of at least limit it to the home, at least limit it to, and the home being an issue because this goes into the Fourth Amendment as well. There's been this historical tendency to really say, in your own home, we don't want there to be an invasion of privacy. In your own home, we don't want that. We want you to be able to have a right of self-defense. It's developed almost a mythical status in American law, and it's one that's beyond what, especially in the modern age. I mean, the idea that the right of self-defense is only in your home makes no sense. The idea that there's a right of privacy only in your own home, it may be heightened in that context in terms of reasonableness of expectations for a search or seizure analysis under the Fourth Amendment, but it's not the sole and whole place that you have privacy interest or self-defense interest. But they wanted to keep it limited to that as well. They also didn't want the shift of standards so that there's no longer, because despite the Supreme Court saying you have a right to keep and bear arms, a lot of lower courts, especially the Ninth Circuit, keeps affirming a whole bunch of gun law restrictions. But California is always coming up with new restrictions. Restrictions that, again, only disparately impact law-abiding people because it hasn't stopped gun violence at all in California. They keep increasing the legal restrictions. Gun violence keeps rising. So, there's just, but that, because to me, it's about the state having as much power as possible and the individual having as little as possible. But that's their argument. Their argument falls within those three categories that, hey, at least it lets it keep this bifurcated legal standard that allowed a lot of gun restrictions to stay in place. Let's not extend it meaningfully beyond the home in terms of gun rights. And let's and really, this is supposed to be a militia clause, not an individual clause anyway. Now, somebody in the chat mentioned how this impacts the 10th Amendment. Here, the 14th Amendment changed the game. So the 14th Amendment and the net effect of the Civil War is such that, and that's to that super chat question, there's already states passing laws making changes, and the Congress is right now. All of it's going to be challenged again, and there's current cases pending in a bunch of federal courts where courts have already issued opinion that they're now probably going to have to go back and reconsider in light of this decision, because this goes beyond concealed and carry in New York. Because what they did is they changed the legal analysis. So the legal analysis is much less deferential to the state government. And to those people who are like, hey, that sounds like a violation of the 10th Amendment, which keeps certain powers reserved to the states. two answers to that. First, the Second Amendment was always a carve-out from the 10th Amendment. The 10th came after the Second. Second, as its application to the states, that was clarified by the Civil War and the post-Civil War constitutional amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment, that borrowed all of those other amendments and enforced them against the states. So there is no 10th Amendment analysis, in my view, to do here. The Second Amendment clearly applies to the states, so its clear, specific language as to this issue trumps the 10th Amendment, trumps the 9th Amendment, though the Second Amendment is kind of an enforcement of the 9th Amendment. And the net effect of it is that these laws now, it'll be very difficult for state governments to restrict gun laws. In my view, guns should translate to knife laws easily because, as the Supreme Court has previously said, the Second Amendment is really a self-defense right. I've argued that it should apply to state criminal proceedings, a range of other proceedings. They haven't yet done that, but the logic of it would. I mean, Scalia in Heller said the right of self-defense is what's protected under the Second Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms being merely the most effective means of doing so. It's also a right of individualized military, but that they haven't followed through on logically.
Go on. No, go on. Okay, what are the political implications of this? What is the political effect of this going to be on the United States? Is this going to be a bad result for the administration? Is it going to galvanize the Democrats to vote for their people when the midterms come? I'm not quite sure to what purpose, because presumably they can't overturn this, as it's a constitutional provision now. But what are the effects going to be? Is it going to be demoralizing? Is it going to make people angry? What's it going to do?
I think the net effect, I saw Alex briefly committed a Vanishing Viva act.
I don't know what happened.
It just vanishes, then voila, he's back.
Disappeared.
Exactly. But two, mostly a net plus for conservatives. So especially given this week, the Republican Senate went along with a bunch of gun control provisions, including trying to encourage states to pass red flag laws that, is basically giving the Amber Heards of the world the power to rat you out to the state or feds to have your Second Amendment rights stripped from you. That could have been very demoralizing for big parts of the Republican base for turnout purposes come November. This case basically completely counters that, I think, politically. This case will so excite the Second Amendment voting base, which is very big. Like, one of the other myths amongst the left is that gun control is a gun manufacturer, because they filter the world through corrupt corporations and the West. They all sound like 1980s commies, but the Western bourgeois. That's how media. And it's all the NRA. And so that's why you have all these movies and documentaries about how some of the NRA is manipulating politicians to vote a certain way. All nonsense. This is what a lot of people who are from the left, like to this day, a lot of people on the left think that guns are about hunting. And it has almost nothing to do with hunting in terms of its political belief in it. It's about my right of self-defense. That's for the ordinary person. And against not only another individual, against the state. That's how these people correctly perceive its history, and that has a long embedded history. And so it's not about hunting or anything else. So for them, this Second Amendment decision is big because it counters their deep disappointment, grievous disappointment at major legislation being passed, legislation that could only pass the Senate if more than 20, at least 20% of the Senate Republicans jumped ship. And that's what happened, including some people I don't know what some people are thinking. It's all the senators who aren't facing an election right now, other than Murkowski in Alaska, who's trying to thread the needle because probably no meaningful Democrat will oppose her. And so she's going to try to win as a Republican who's really a Democrat with Democratic votes. But for the most part, there are people that are either retiring or that are not up for a re-election until 2026, like McConnell, like Graham, like Capito of West Virginia. What she's thinking. Clearly McConnell doesn't plan on running for re-election. Clearly Graham probably is thinking Graham's MO is he's an elitist for 5 years. Then when it comes to election year, suddenly he's a conservative populist. And so and Republicans just swoop that stuff up. It's amazing how often they take the bait on this. I don't know if that can continue. Trump is largely responsible for that too. People wanted to oppose Graham in the 2020 primaries, wanted to oppose McConnell in the 2020 primaries. It was Trump that prohibited that. Now he's even kind of quasi-publicly apologized on McConnell. he needs to start publicly apologizing on Lindsey Graham. But Lindsey Graham is a favorite of Sean Hannity for a reason. The cheap war whore. So there'll be some individual impacts for them. I think this will be remembered by key members in the Republican base in ways that they won't be able to keep doing what they did and maintain sort of a Bushite Republican Party institutionally when the base has rejected it. But so that's sort of the longer term. In the near short term, the decision negates the bad acts of the Senate for turnout purposes, and I think there's not a lot of Democratic voters who obsess over gun control. Like, gun control is another issue where you have issue disparity in the sense that you can get 65% of people to basically go along with some form of gun control. That's because most of them don't care. The people who care are the gun owners and a small group of liberals. But from a voting base perspective, it's a 3-1, 4-1 Second Amendment or pro-Second Amendment voting disparity. In some states, the more rural it is, the more small town it is, the more middle of southern part of the country it is, the more that it's robustly on the gun rights side of the aisle. So politically, the Second Amendment decision net plus for the midterms for Republicans.
Right. It's interesting that there are some Republicans who seem willing to antagonize the Republican base. We have this expression in Britain, which we all say is American. It's a very one widely used amongst British politicians, though they don't follow it very often, I have to say, which is that the most important rule, the first rule of politics, is you look after your base. So quite how it is that the McConnells and people like that imagine that that's consistent with doing something that annoys, that angers most of their base. I mean, I simply don't understand. Why? Go on.
Yeah. No, I agree entirely. It's insanity. The Republican, I mean, really what's happened is since the 1988, the Bushite wing of the Republican Party took over. It's why for a lot of young generations are shocked to discover that Joe Biden has a long warmongering history. Like, being pro-war was being a Republican for people who grew up politically after 1988. Because Poppy Bush, Panama, Iraq, wherever else he could have gone, he would have. Then W was the next Republican, Iraq 2, Afghanistan, a few other places he would have liked to have gone. And so only Trump was an exception, and TDS dominated so much they couldn't realize that Trump was actually a return to the old Republican base. To give an example, I was down at the World War II Museum in New Orleans, and I was most curious about two things. One was, how were they going to deal with the Russian-Soviet impact on World War II? Or like for most of American history, we don't really have much detail. I was shocked. I mean, I considered myself well-informed. 2006 over in St. Petersburg, and they take me to the Great Patriotic Wars, they call it, various museums and other places. I had no idea, as a well-educated American, of the number of people who died on the Russian side of that war. I mean, such that to this day, 1 out of 2 Russians know somebody in their direct family line that either fought or died in the conflict. And that's just a crazy, crazy number. American Civil War didn't get close to that. So and that was very traumatic on the American political consciousness. So so that kind of but the other aspect of the World War II Museum that I was curious about was how they were going to talk about the people who opposed the war. And of course, they have a whole section on the scary, scary isolationists. But what's fascinating is all the old Republican buttons, like GOP stood for Great Old Peace. All right. I mean, that's the Republican history that's been forgot about because the Bushites contaminated it. And so I think we're going to start to see more of a return to it. Definitely agree with Lindsey Graham. I mean, people should go back if they think that the Ukraine war started in February of this year. Just listen to what Lindsey Graham and John McCain had to say on the ground in 2014 in Ukraine. That's who Lindsey has always been. Trump never should have put him back up. But this continued betrayal of the Republican base reflects the Bushite takeover, hijacking of the Republican cause that we're still purging the last aspects of. And there's a disparity in that the elites, like when Jacob Drazen was talking about, well, there's not much movement in Washington opposed to the war. What he's referring to is sort of the deep state elites and the apparatus around the Republican establishment wing of the party, as well as the Democratic Party, that in the representatives, in the think tanks, in the academy, there is still a strong Bushite wing of republicanism that could care less, that hates having the peasants, always having to appeal to the peasants to get power. So they don't really agree with him on abortion. They don't really agree with him on guns. They don't really agree with him on church. They would not like to have to deal with any of them. What this court is doing a good job of so far is they are truly committed. And they're finally, I mean, they've been promising Republicans a lot of things for decades. Hey, get us in. We'll put conservative justices on. And then we didn't get conservative justices. We got Sandra Day O'Connor. We got Anthony Kennedy. We got judges who are saying, hey, there's a nationwide right to gay marriage, and we're just going to skip the whole state legislative process when it comes to that. And so things like that was not what the conservatives thought they voted for, finally delivering for them. I mean, if they deliver on Roe, that will be reversing Roe. That will be a massive win for the pro-life base. And contrary to conventional wisdom, it will probably just help Democrats raise money. It will not help them in November, because the real strong voting base on that issue, the kind of people who don't tend to vote or may not vote, those groups are overwhelmingly lean pro-life, not pro-choice. The pro-choice voter always votes. The pro-life voter sometimes doesn't. Same.
Are we going to get a Roe decision before the midterms?
Definitely. So I've said 99% chance we will get the Roe reversal decision this month, in my view, but definitely before the end of the summer. I will be shocked that I was part of one of the occasionally one or two cases in a term will be passed over, or including a cert petition will be passed over to the next term. I had a case that it was a Wesley Snipes case challenging handwriting exemplars and their constitutionality. And it was one of only two cases that term that got passed over. It's really unheard of for them to pass over a term. It will look very, very bad for the U.S. Supreme Court because of the leak, because of the efforts to intimidate the court, assassination efforts against conspiracies against Justice Kavanaugh that people were recently elected, illegal stalking done outside of Supreme Court homes. All of these, if the Supreme Court doesn't issue a decision that looks a lot like that decision that got leaked, the message will be you can intimidate the United States Supreme Court. You can illegally leak information, and then you can stalk them and harass them and attack them on social media, create little militia-type groups that are talking about Jane's revenge. If the decision comes down, they're going to take violent action. There's already been violent attacks on pro-life pregnancy centers all across the country. Threats of attacks that are on top of that. The Western media doesn't cover it because it's they'll love to cover anybody who's pro-life who takes violent action, but they're not going to cover pro-choice people who take violent action, except to occasionally wink at it or celebrate it, as people in the blue checkmark crowd did. So if the U.S. Supreme Court does not issue that decision that looks like Alito on Roe, reversing Roe, it will be maybe the most devastating decision for the public opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court that has ever happened. And the U.S. Supreme Court's made some real brain-dead decisions. Dred Scott probably helped bring about the Civil War. As just one illustration amongst many, Bush v. Gore was ahead of the curve in terms of the political opinion curve in terms of trying to determine a presidential election winner. So those were both really PR damaging cases. They wouldn't come close to what would happen if they don't reverse Roe with this term. And that means they're on the clock, and they don't even have any scheduled opinion dates yet. But they have issued decisions outside of their scheduled opinion dates. It's just usually they really do try to stick to it. So I thought it would come down today. But the fact they also were sitting on several other decisions told me, okay, that they're fine tuning that, I guess. And it's not just a Roe case that they're sitting on. There's a couple of ones they're trying to tidy up and edit. But I'll be shocked if one doesn't issue. If it doesn't issue, it will look really, really bad for the U.S. Supreme Court. That means there'll be more illegal leaks, threats, harassment, and stalking because people will say, look, it worked.
There's been a lot of rumors about the reasons for the delay in publishing Roe. I've been reading some really troubling articles in places like the Federalist. And of course, it's Roberts who gets criticized. People say that he's holding it back because he's trying to get it changed. So I think if Roberts is careful about his own reputation, I mean, I think he, go ahead and publish this thing, because it's doing potentially damage to the Chief Justice of the United States to sit on this for too long. This is my own personal view. Quite over and above what you were saying about the damage to the Supreme Court as well. I have to say, I'm going to just say a quick thing about Roe, the original Roe decision. I read it, in the context of these recent decisions, the leak, and of course I also read the draft opinion, the Alito opinion. And I have to say, I mean, the original decision, the Roe decision, is one of the strangest decisions I have ever read in my life. It conjures up a right out of, well, I'm not going to say thin air, because that would be unfair, but not out of very much more. I mean, it's the most extraordinary evolution of privacy rights. I'm being very careful what I'm going to say, that I've ever come across. And I have to say that in Europe, having a court make a decision like that on an issue of such importance would seem extraordinary. And the reasoning behind it would seem more extraordinary still. Now, as I said, all I'm going to say about this decision, I mean, you probably gather that from what I've just said, I think the logic of the draft opinion is inexorable. It's absolutely logical and irresistible. But I'm just amazed that Roe was ever decided in the way that it was, actually.
I mean, no doubt. I mean, you have basically three approaches to Roe. You either have a constitutional right to a particular medical procedure. And that was what was kind of extraordinary. It's like, it's one thing to say you have a right of privacy. It's another thing to say that right to privacy entitles you to a particular medical procedure that impacts another life. But that's, the primary premise of Roe, though it was heavily rooted in giving power to doctors. It had a strong eugenicist bias. There's a lot of eugenics folks that had been pushing this going back half a century. Planned Parenthood had a lot of eugenics ties. I've told the story of the, sitting down next the organization I co-sponsored with Justice Breyer's daughter at Yale, and sitting down next to one of the top Planned Parenthood people, and him giving me a Bill Gates type explanation about, he goes, Robert, have you seen where the world is increasing? And I was like, you're not saying what I think you're saying, are you? I was like, am I like in the Great Gatsby 1920s novel or something? You're explaining how we got to limit all the brown people? But that's exactly what he was saying. So there was that part of it too, politically, sort of power to the state, power to the medical profession, power at the expense of the people in the population. But the legal theory was there's a constitutional right to demand a particular medical procedure based on the right to privacy, which was an interesting combination. Then you had the hardcore pro-life position, which is that the fetal life has a constitutional right to life under is a protected life under the 14th Amendment's right, the 5th and 14th Amendment's right to life, effectively the right to due process of a law for the protection of both property, liberty, and life interest. And that would be the U.S. Supreme Court holding that you could never restrict or you could never allow abortion outside of very limited circumstances, because you'd still have a self-defense issue. Like if the woman's well-being is endangered, does she have a right to take another life? And it's a big philosophical debate, moral debate, and legal debate. But that was one interpretation. Where the U.S. Supreme Court is heading is in the middle, which is to say whether or not this one life or the other has certain protection should not be a U.S. Supreme Court question. That the first question we should ask is not who's right, but who decides who's right. And their view is who decides who's right is really clear by the 10th Amendment, which is that's the states. That in this context, who's right about whether a human life exists within the meaning of the 14th Amendment, to whether and how that would impact it either way. All of that should be decided at the state level. Like what people will be surprised at is when Roe gets reversed, the net effect of it will not be abortion banned throughout America. The laws will not change in California. The law will not change in New York. The law will not change in Illinois. What you will have is there'll be wide, broad legal rights to abortion in all of those places. What is those states that don't favor liberalized abortion laws, their laws will go in. Now, about half of the country will ban abortion almost entirely because they have laws that are triggered. As soon as the U.S. Supreme Court issues a decision, the law goes into force. Some of those will be modified. But the other, like as I've discussed with Richard Barris, People's Pundit, who's the best pollster in America by far, is that the majority American opinion, really, it's a really even split pro-life, pro-choice. What you'll see is fake polls come out of America where people are asked, do you support overturning Roe v. Wade? And you'll get, 2/3 of the country say no. But that's because they think Roe is about rights to abortion at all, not about rights to abortion unlimited. And when you ask specific questions, do you favor restricting abortion once the fetal life can feel pain, once the fetus has a heartbeat, once there's brain activity? Overwhelmingly, 3/4 of the country say they do not favor abortion once the fetus can feel pain, once there's a heartbeat, once there's brain activity. Now, science has we have a much different view of science than we did at the time of Roe. We now know that starts very early. I mean, most of the world doesn't have abortion after the first trimester. America's unusual. We have some extremely liberal abortion laws. California was trying to make it legal for 28 days after the baby is born, otherwise known as infanticide, somehow not in California's language. Alex Jones famously mimicked the Democratic Virginia governor about, swaddling up the little baby. And then, so the ordinate, I think that's the other reason why if Roe is reversed, there won't be the political backlash that the media and press will predict, because people realize, I just get to decide at my local level. That's the net effect. This is supposed to be Handmaid's Tale. How exactly is this Handmaid's Tale? So I don't think. I think the Supreme Court will salvage the Republican incompetency in managing their own elections, because I think the combination of Roe and the Second Amendment. I also think the EPA decision will dramatically restrict these administrative state agencies, these liberal clerical bureaucrats who are running so much of people's lives. And it's probably a good transition, is Putin's victory speech, even partially talked about in St. Petersburg. It's amazing. Here we are in America, everybody in the West, and if you wanted a realistic, objective, true realpolitik analysis of the world, the best place you can go is Vladimir Putin. I mean, because that speech laid out much better than any place what's been happening, what is happening, what they tried to do, what they failed to do, because he has a much more clear-eyed view than anybody in the West. Whereas, we have our people trained by one of the most prominent Yale historians of Russia affairs. This is who trains many of the members of the CIA, trains many members of the State Department, trains many members of the think tanks, has educated them, and his proteges educating them at other colleges, just like Stephen Kotkin in Princeton. You have them going out and saying things like the Yale historian saying that Russia's been busy kidnapping Ukrainians. Over 300,000 Ukrainians have been kidnapped from Russia and are now in detention camps in Russia. It's like, how do you say something so insanely false? And then you realize this guy taught the people that are actually making decisions in the State Department, actually making decisions at the think tanks. The reason why the West is where it's at is because we have idiots like that in America's academies making policy decisions directly or indirectly. And the reason why Russia is where it's at is because Putin is the most clear-eyed guy in the room as to what's really happening. You can like him, hate him, agree with him, disagree with him. He is still the most clear-eyed guy in the room by far. He understands it better than anybody.
Absolutely. Can I just say it was an extraordinary speech for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was incredibly structured. Secondly, and I don't know about you, Robert, but I have been a speech writer. I've written speeches for politicians, my aunt, for example. I can say definitely this speech is largely written by the man who delivered it. Putin wrote most of it. It's too much one person's voice, and the fact that it avoids rhetorical flourishes is again another sign that he's largely written by Putin himself. That's the second thing I'd say. And the third thing is it's extraordinarily measured and restrained and calm. Contrast that with a sort of hysteria that you get over here from all sorts of people. He doesn't bandy and throw around insults. He carries out cold, rational analysis, and it's an extraordinary contrast. And as you said, it shows, on the one hand, why he's winning, but it also shows that he knows that he is winning. So when you said that it was a victory speech, that essentially is what it was. He's extremely confident at this moment. And of course, at this moment in time, people in London, in Washington, I'm sure, as you probably tell us, in Brussels, certainly, are not confident. I, on the contrary, sense that they're beginning to panic, because clearly the military situation in Ukraine, I don't think anybody now has any doubt about where it's going. I mean, you only had to look at the media coverage of the war over the last couple of days to see that there's now been this great sudden realization that no, Ukraine isn't going to win. Russia is winning. It's winning decisively. It's winning hands down. And it's no longer possible to either conceal that or pretend otherwise. That's one thing that's happening. But the second is that the economic war, the sanctions war, has turned out horribly. Now, you're probably slightly less exposed to that in the US than we are here in Britain and in Europe. But of course, here in Britain and in Europe, you can almost sense the hand-wringing now that's going on. How is this turning out the way it was? This wasn't what it was supposed to be like. We weren't, expecting that instead of the Russians, it would be we who were suffering. And what are we going to do? And you sent us, to Alex and myself, a extremely brilliant discussion of the three streams of opinion within the permanent government of the United States, the deep state, if you like, of the United States. And I was wondering if you could sort of broaden that out and share that with our viewers.
Brilliant. That was a brilliant.
It was brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you could share that with everybody, Robert, that would be fantastic.
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
brilliant.
Definitely. Absolutely. To the earlier super chat question, I don't think Russia would offer anything for Julian Assange. That's just not inside of Putin's DNA. The fact he protected Snowden was just him protecting Snowden, but he wouldn't have gone out of his way to do that affirmatively. But it would be a great way for them to troll the West. Maybe offer the Brits. You send us Assange, we'll send you back those 2 Brits that are holding it, just like that. Because Brit won't. I mean, it'd be, if they want to troll them and draw attention, that'd be a great way to do it. And that'd be very, very Russian these days. I mean, they become like master trolls and what the kind of stuff they're doing. They've been the press secretary, the press foreign affairs lady, and of course Lavrov, who's did it with the rest. But yeah,
Donetsk People's Republic Square.
Yeah, exactly. Right across from the U.S. Embassy. I mean, they're just doing. I mean, some of the people they put on their sanctions list were clearly ha ha ha. They sat around laughing. It was like the old Cossacks when they were writing the famous letter to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and the famous painting. They're all, the actual letter was crude as all get out, but it's in that spirit, and it's been just from a entertainment perspective, it's been fun to watch. And I do like watching Lavrov develop more aggressivity with Western media. Like that latest BBC one was him cross-examining the BBC reporter. And the BBC reporter not being cognizant of where his arguments go. But there's a deep, as you guys have been tracking, there's a deep divide within the deep state in America because you're seeing things that seem contradictory. One day it's almost like a day in the life of Zelensky, where one day he was reading off of this script, the next minute he's reading off that script, and he doesn't realize the 2 scripts contradict each other because he's just busy reading off scripts. When he's not ready for Tropic Thunder 2 with Sean Penn and Ben Stiller, they were probably reviewing the screenplay for when they were over there, and this continuing embarrassment. I think these people don't know how the world looks at this, particularly a lot of the global South. I mean, you heard even Lula saying this is a crock, this is a joke. How these people are behaving. This is not how you behave in a war. This is, I get when you grow up in reality TV, you apparently think you can just create your own TV show as a living president during a war and it will all work. And it's not. I mean, it would be great for Putin to try to trade for Assange. Now, he would be doing it to troll, to be honest with you. But why not have some fun? But the divide in the deep state is definitely real. It's in part because the Ukraine can't stay on script. Like, the other day, Ukraine general came out and was like, this weapon sucks, that weapon sucks, 2 out of 5 this time. He doesn't realize you're part of a marketing campaign, bro. You're supposed to stay on message. But you have what you could loosely call the neoliberals, strongly present in the State Department, CIA, some of the intelligence branches, used to be really strong at the 7th floor of the FBI. That's their bureaucratic institutional source of power. They're globalist, but but their mindset is more Obama than it is Bush. And that's their strength. This goes all the way back to the Bush era, where Powell and his crowd were the most restrained on pursuing certain war policies than some of the others. But so that they are the most, in this context, though, irrational when it comes to Russia. George Soros affiliated NGOs have a lot of influence in this same sector. They're strongly aligned with the Brits. They're strongly aligned with the EU. These are the people that were very anti-Trump. They were part of both impeachment efforts, the Russiagate effort, et cetera. Like the 7th floor of the FBI, where they had a lot of allies, which mattered as they went after Trump. A lot of them got purged because of the mistakes of Spygate and Russiagate in inquiries. So they're not as strong there as they used to be. Though Merrick Garland was eager to say the DOJ's on their side by flying himself over to Ukraine and chatting up with the Ukrainian prosecutor. I wonder if he talked to them about why is Ukraine treating POWs as ordinary criminals and sentencing them to life. Apparently he didn't get around to that. Like the most egregious Geneva Convention violations have been taking place by the Ukrainians. There's issues with how Donetsk and Russia's handling this, but nowhere near as egregious as what Ukraine is doing. My guess is Merrick Garland didn't get around to that. For those that don't know around the world, Merrick Garland got his political name to fame by, for some of our perspectives, connected to the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. He used that to go, whew. And there's some people that have questions about what he covered up in that process. There was something called Operation PatCon, an effort by the FBI after the end of the Cold War to create their own fake militias that may have blown back in what happened at Oklahoma City. Southern Poverty Law Center was running informants. There was race grifters out of a little town in eastern Oklahoma that were connected to like the Aryan groups that were organized out of the prisons that were doing robberies. I mean, it's a wild story. There's even an East German son of a high-ranking intelligence officer that shows up in the middle of the Oklahoma City story, who disappeared late at night. So it's like a dozen hush-hushes in one. I have a hush-hush about part of it there, but that gives an idea who Merrick Garland is. Garland didn't rise to fame by some, Elliot Ness-style investigations and inquiries when he was a federal prosecutor. People know him now as the guy who lost the U.S. Supreme Court bid when Scalia died. They know him as the D.C. Circuit Judge. They don't realize his real political background was being a very politicized prosecutor, managing law enforcement power so that only a certain narrative came out of certain events. So it's not a surprise that he's doing that way, but basically that's that wing. The neoliberal side, power in the State Department, power at the CIA, trained by the people I was talking about earlier, the Yale historians, the Princeton historians, the Ivy League historians. And if people in the West or people around the world want to understand how degraded our objective capability of analysis is, like Alexander was talking about yesterday about that you have a lot of people in the school of realism in the U.S. government who are not realistic because they don't understand objectively the reality. It's because they don't employ strategic empathy. They're historically illiterate, and they're bad at functional economics and politics. And that's who our typical State Department person is. So that group, it's Russia must lose. That's it. End of story. There's no other alternative. Russia must lose. Russia must lose. Russia must lose. These are the people conjuring up. Let's see if we can expand it to Transnistria. Let's see if we can expand it to Georgia. Let's see if we can expand it to the Black Sea. Let's see if we can expand it to Kaliningrad, trying to create second, third, and fourth fronts in this conflict. This is the group that won't give up. The CSIS recently did a little conference about this, and you can tell they're like still committed. We must go forward. We must go forward. We must go forward. These are the people, and they're waging a PR war because they are in trouble with the political class, and there's other parts of the deep state that don't agree with them. So that's where the State Department CIA types are. In the middle, And they have strong allies at the Washington Post. That's their primary publication. They also have allies in the New York Times and institutional media and the rest. But the strongest is at the Washington Post. You want to know what they're thinking? You can read the anonymous sources at the Washington Post. The next group is the Defense Department. And again, there's always exceptions and dissidents within each of these groups of the deep state. And there's people that are not aligned with the deep state in each of these institutions, but they have nowhere near dominant influence. The Defense Department, the reality is the dominant influence is the military industrial complex. That, how do you fund war, right? In order you need the fear of war, but at some point to show off your weapons, you need actual wars. And, that's why there's always a war at some point in the world, all the time, right? So if one shuts down, another pops up because you got to advertise and sell these goods. You need to replenish, you need a new contract. So now for them, this was a huge windfall in everything. I mean, just massive money's being spent. Everything that gets emptied must in turn get replenished and refreshed. So it's an excuse. So even if they're emptying old weapon systems, there's going to be a demand to replace those with new weapon systems. So that's their goal. The problem for them in Ukraine is what good is spending a lot of money on American trainers and NATO trainers and spending a lot of money on actual weapons if they just get their head handed to them, which appears to be what's happening militarily. What happens if your weapon system sucks so bad that Zelensky and the Ukrainian generals can't help but yip about it on national TV? There is such a thing as bad publicity when it comes to the military industrial complex. The Javelin missile system has had a lot of bad publicity in this conflict. The other weapon systems have had, some of the drone fighting systems have had bad publicity, including the Turkish drones, American drones, other drones. Some of the tanks have, some of the missile systems have, some of the other systems have. And I mean, we just sent over some weapons. And aside from the Ukrainians taking the genius idea of let's take U.S. weapons and bomb residential neighborhoods in Donetsk, just humiliate Americans for sending that aid over in the first place, to commit war crimes using U.S. weapons. But the other thing, I mean, they keep saying 2 out of 5 break down, 3 out of 5 break down. They don't work after this point. They have this problem. They have that problem. So, and now what a lot of them don't realize is in Ukraine is they're there to help the weapons industry. The weapons industry ain't there to help them. They don't understand what the real deal is. They are a pretext to line the profits of the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about as, again, one of the greatest American generals. So it's not like he's anti-military in 1961 in his famous farewell address. So the concern in the Pentagon is they're about to get humiliated, that they're about to lose advertising value that's backfired on a whole bunch of weapon systems and on their own training. So they would like an exit ramp where they can pretend that their great training and their great weapon systems stopped Russia from taking over Ukraine. So just give them the South, give them a little bit of the East, let them keep that, and we'll pretend we won. Because it doesn't, I mean, it was the reason why they started off by saying Russia wanted to win in 72 hours, that they wanted Victory Day in Russia to be the day they've actually won all of Ukraine. They were setting up a ridiculous objective so they could say, see, we beat them, right? An old game. Say, oh, you want this. Actually, you don't want that, but I claim you do. So that when you don't get that, I say I beat you. So that was part of their goal. Almost all those ships have sailed now. And the problem is they're in a position where the U.S. military industry is going to look like a hollowed out post-Vietnam empty tiger that is not able or capable of actually supporting war against a major opponent on the ground. So that's why they want an exit ramp, a face-saving exit ramp. And they go back and forth on this. And this is why you're seeing a lot of debate about, are they winning? Are they losing? Like you see one piece one day about, oh, this is an inevitable disaster. They got to do territorial concessions. And the next day, Newsweek comes out saying Ukraine is really winning. They're just about to win. And don't listen to all this nonsense. That's the State Department side, right? So these people are arguing through the court of public opinion because they're arguing to the policymakers who are getting more and more nervous about what's happening. The big problem for the deep state's war on Russia is what you mentioned at the beginning, Alexander. Russia won. This was supposed to be a wipeout. I've said from the beginning, I don't think that we ever had a military or political strategy to win the war for Ukraine. We had an economic strategy that we thought that was the whole thing was provoke Russia to go into Ukraine, use that as a pretext to wage economic war against Russia, and prove that Kissinger's theory that if you control currencies, you control the globe is true. And to show the world, if you stick your head up, look what we did to Putin. We took him out, his country out, his economy out, his political structure out like that. So you better behave and keep your head low, whether you're some small country in Africa or you're Xi in China. Keep your head down and behave. What was not supposed to happen was Putin winning. That was, I guarantee you, never in their thought process. The people, the State Department, the Soros NGOs, they still can't understand it. And they just they're convincing themselves somehow this is just artificial and fake. And it's just about to fall apart. Just one more. It's like Afghanistan. We're just about to win, everybody. We're just about to win for every week for 20 years. So the problem is that failed. And Kissinger, like there is also a broader debate between what you could call the Kissingers and what Putin called the kindergartners. So like Putin's like only kindergartners who haven't gone through primary school could believe these blaming me for the West self-imposed economic problems is on me. I would love to think I had that power, but I don't. There's a lot of that because it's these people trained by these bad Ivy Leaguers. Take Stephen Kotkin, right, at Princeton University. Lex Friedman promoted him as an important voice on the war on Russia. This is a guy who thinks that Stalin was really pretty much a nice guy, but the poor Ruskies made him crazy. I mean, that's his analysis for Russia. Leading Princeton Ivy Leaguer. And he thinks Stalin was a sweetheart, except for those mean Ruskies who turned him a little crazy. I mean, that is insanity. That's not history. That is insanity. Yet this is the leading guy teaching people at Princeton in the Ivy League. And that's look at the CIA's roster. It was started at Yale. I mean, it's a long Ivy League roster of people. I got to meet James Woolsey there when I was a kid. He explained to me how we could still kill foreign leaders and assassinate them outside the assassination clause. He explained, Robert, this was live in the CIA at their cafeteria during a Yale Political Union event, where he said, how do you define foreign leader? And I was like, so he's like, so maybe we can't assassinate them. Oh, okay. All right. Glad to know the CIA's reformed since MK Ultra and everything else. But the Treasury Department realizes they lost. Kissinger, the kindergartners are strong in the State Department. Some are at the Defense Department, weaker at the Treasury Department. The Kissinger types, in reverse from his own personal past, are strongest in the Treasury Department, decent in the Defense Department, weak in the State Department. And what I mean by Kissingers is that they're just more capable of being realist, more capable of realpolitik analysis. Believe in it. Now, that doesn't mean that they're skilled at it, because there's still a fundamental flaw. And there's not many Mearsheimers in actual positions of power, is what it boils down to. There's not many Kaplans. There's very few of those guys. They're the older generation, and most of them are gone. But those that do exist are strong in the Treasury Department. And this is where the Wall Street financial banking elite, that side of the deep state's institutional influence, is strongest at the Treasury and the Fed. It's not a coincidence that Biden did not consult the Fed before he announced the sanctions. It's not a coincidence that Jamie Dimon, head of Chase Bank, came out and said, are we sure this is such a great idea? Because these are people some of these were people who were skeptical from the get-go. They didn't think it was worth the risk of dollar dominance, of global economic control, of supply chain interruption to issue sanctions against Russia, because they feared the consequence would be divestment by the East from the West. If you're wealthy or powerful, why do you still have money or property in the West? They just proved they'll go and take anytime they want. I mean, they're doing it to Abramovich, a guy who's not even that pro-Putin. They took away his soccer club. They took away his yachts. Now they're seizing his planes here in America. And doing so even though he doesn't legally own them, he owns them indirectly. And they're expanding the sanctions to grab anything. People like Jamie Dimon were like, this might not be so good for our investment environment. Then you had people worried about the dollar dominance. They're like, what happens if the world realizes they shouldn't have the dollar? That for those who want global bank-backed digital currencies, will anybody be on board for that when they see how easily you use that to strip them of their assets, to strip them of their wealth, to really strip them, as Putin put it, of their sovereignty. So there were concerns voiced, but they were suppressed by Janet Yellen and the rest, who were convinced this would work on Russia. When it didn't, Kissinger was for him to go over to the World Economic Forum at Davos and tell them, time to exit, time to exit. This was his realization. This had failed. And before we go off a Kabul-sized cliff, we need to get out now. That pressure continues to escalate because of domestic U.S. economic problems, which they're just as bad in Europe, worse actually in parts of Europe. But you look at what's happening in the U.S., we have inflation out of control at the highest rate in 40 years. And if you want to see what real inflation looks like, go to a place called Shadow Stats. They use the old inflation metrics we used to have and just tell you what they would be if we were using the same metrics in the 1970s. And that puts our inflation at 15 to 16%. So that's problem one. And the problem two is there's been this mythology that Paul Volcker cured inflation with interest rate rises. There's Jeff Snyder, a lot of independent economic analysts that say that isn't actually what happened. And that a lot of other things happened. And the Volcker myth is kind of dangerous because it convinced the Fed they could get out of any economic problem. Right now, the Fed is trying to do that. But the problem is, as they raise interest rates, they're sinking the housing market, they're sinking the stock market, but they're not sinking inflation. So these two markets we've used in a consumer-driven American economy to keep things afloat almost artificially, especially during the lockdown when we printed a ridiculous amount of money, which was Putin's primary point economically, is maybe you printing all this money has something to do with the money supply value going down and inflation, just maybe. When you print 40 trillion, it has a problem. And so you look at that dynamic in the States, and there's even more pressure to end the conflict from the Treasury side. They can't, the supply chain interruptions, the inflationary increases, like we get more of it indirectly in the United States, but we still get it. When there's supply chain issues in Europe, there'll be supply chain issues ultimately in America. When there are cost issues that are changing global markets, that will come back on the United States. And, Biden attempting to say, hey, it's the greedy oil company's fault, won't sell because of his own policies. You can't say it's the Putin price hike 1 minute and say it's the Exxon price hike the next minute. Which is it? Come up with a story and stick with it. The reality is his war on oil, war on fossil fuels, just like Sri Lanka just discovered, trying to institute ESG policies can lead to a famine, as that country's about to do. Climate change policies on this scale are simply not sustainable in the current environment. And you add to that what the sanctions have done, on top of all the insanity of what we printed in the lockdown, and the Treasury Department realizes they may not be able to get us out of this situation. So what they don't want is continued escalation with Russia. What they don't want is spending billions and billions and billions more on Ukraine. They want out. And for Kissinger to go to Davos to preach that showed you how significant that constituency is to go public. And so that's where the deep state divide is. Treasury wants out now, that part of the deep state. The Defense Department wants an exit ramp. And the State Department says, this is do or die. We must win now. We cannot ever give up. We cannot ever quit. This is Hitler. This is 1942. We must march onward. And it's going to be interesting watching this. And you'll see it on the front pages of major magazines, major papers, people arguing on TV, because but ultimately Treasury tends to win. So I haven't read that book. That's interesting. I'll take a look at that. After the Empire. But yes, so that's where we're at. We feel like a dying, decaying empire. We feel like the old colonial governments that got too out of touch in their local communities or constituencies. But it is a real political brawl. And in Biden, we have a dementia candidate in the middle of it. So he's busy reading off scripts, not sure which script he's supposed to read on a given day. I mean, the guy literally cannot walk up the stairs without falling down, cannot ride a bike without falling down. We are in a new state of disgrace. I sent Alex what he said yesterday, which is him saying, you could sum up America in one word. And he was like, it's like, oh, man. This is a bad Monty Python skit.
That's coming in a video tomorrow. That's going to open everything.
It was just classic. So, yeah, but the deep state divide is real here. Hopefully the saner side, I never thought I would say I hope the Kissingerites win. But in this context, I actually do, because we need to get out of this. Not figure out a way to, maybe we could wage nuclear war over Kaliningrad. I mean, these people are insane.
Yeah, that absolutely. I completely agree. Can I just say that, we're talking about realism. One of the features of a realist is that you're realistic about yourself, about your own limits. And of course, this is something that Putin has and the Russians do. I mean, they're not got illusions that they can do anything, that they have enormous powers that are beyond what they actually do. And I just want to read one paragraph which he gave at this speech, at the speech, when he says, it would even be nice to hear that we are so powerful and omnipotent that we can blow up inflation in the West, in the United States and Europe, or that we can do things to throw everything into disorder. Maybe it would be nice to feel this power if only there were truth in it. The situation has been brewing for years, spurred by the short-sighted actions of those who are used to solving their problems at somebody else's expense and who have relied and still rely on the mechanism of financial emission to outbid and draw trade flows that's escalating deficits and provoking humanitarian disasters in certain regions of the world. I would add, this is essentially the same predatory colonial policy as in the past. So it's not us. We don't have that kind of power. We're not single-handedly creating inflation. We're not imploding the United States. We don't have the ability to do those things. It's the United States, its leaders who've been doing that by themselves. We are bystanders in this. We're even to some extent victims of it, because being part of the world as well, we have been negatively affected by these policies. Now, that is actual realism. It's so different from what you get in the West, where, we go around, we brag, we say that, we've achieved all kinds of things. We're achieving all this. We're winning here. We're winning there. We're always taking credit for things that we don't necessarily do. And that is not realistic. That is delusional. It is extremely dangerous. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. Now, I think the problem is that the Kissinger wing, the Treasury wing, I think they will win out. The question is time. How soon can they win? Because events on the ground in Ukraine are now moving at their own pace. We've been getting information over the last couple of days, in fact, even the last couple of hours, which suggests a military crisis for Ukraine developing in Donbass. And at the same time, as you rightly said, the economic situation is increasingly getting out of control. We now have inflation rising, and you're absolutely right, by the way. Inflation is not something you can simply control through interest rates. You can't just increase interest rates by 5% and bring down inflation. I mean, it's stupid to think this. Far too many people think this. If you're going to bring down inflation, you have to coordinate right across every single policy tool and focus on doing that, and look at all the various other problems that you're creating and prioritize bringing down inflation, and then you can do it. So that's obviously right. But so we have inflation, we have an industrial economic crisis, especially in Europe, where we're running out of essential materials, we're running out of energy, we're running out of food. I showed some time ago to Alex, just a few days ago, pictures of a food bank in London, 50 seconds away from my house, 50 seconds by foot. And this is a very affluent part of London. You don't normally expect to see sites like that here. This is a food bank with a long, long queue of people stretching into the distance trying to get food. We have strikes now in London, in Britain. railway strikes, teachers' strikes. There's strikes apparently pending in the airlines. Lawyers, believe it or not, you may be interested to learn, Robert, are also talking about going on strike. These are the ones who make their money through the government's legal aid system, which is something you don't have in the United States. It's a government-run funds to provide money for people who find themselves in the criminal courts. Anyway, those lawyers are going on strike, and workers right across, not just the public sector now. There's even talk that we might start getting strikes in the private sector as well. So we are in a bad situation in Britain. I'm getting news that in Germany things are going badly wrong there as well. That something like a fifth of companies in Germany are now facing closure because of the escalating energy costs. There's been appalling information coming on the inflation situation in Germany, that underlying inflation is now rising, skyrocketing upwards. We have a government in Germany that is weak and divided and doesn't know what to do, and is still very much under the control of the Green Party, which is essentially allied with the people that you spoke about in the State Department. I mean, they basically are in the same bed together. All of this is coming together at phenomenal speed. So Kissinger at Davos spoke about a 2-month window. The point is, he said that, I think, 3 weeks ago. He was probably right, but that window is closing. What are we going to do? What are we going to do in that time that's left to rescue us from this debacle that we are seeing? And Janet Yellen, she's coming up with some extraordinary ideas. She says that we control oil prices, we put a cap on energy prices all around the world, we put tariffs, global tariffs on the price of Russian oil. So we basically telling, the Indians, if you want to buy Russian oil, you're only allowed to do it at this kind of price. How are you ever going to enforce anything like that? So I take the point that, Treasury eventually wins, but perhaps they don't have as much time as they think they have. And certainly they don't have the time, or so it seems to me, to rescue this administration. This is shaping up to be an almighty debacle. And I think that by November, that will be so visible that it will no longer be possible to argue any way around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what the shared nightmare of all attributes of the deep state in the West, or the U.S. and its allies, which right now apparently is stronger still in at the MI6 and the British crowd, and particularly the War Department / State Department equivalent in the UK, as Boris Johnson runs over to make sure that Zelensky doesn't do a deal every time Zelensky is told to do a deal by the rest of continental Europe that doesn't want to end up looking like 1930s economics all over again. I mean, heck, that's why there's a reason why Hitler was heading to the Caucasus. He wasn't just invading Russia. He was heading to because he needed the oil. I had to get the oil fast. And, the Germans are back to like, we'll just cut ourselves off from the Russian oil. See how that worked. That was a different approach. They could collapse a little quicker, a little sooner. So but I think their shared nightmare is New Year's party in Odessa with Vladimir Putin standing up celebrating the new Novorossiya. That is their shared nightmare. And the State Department is deluding itself into believing that it can prevent that by just continuing to escalate. The Defense Department goes, 1 minute there's, we just have a new weapons game changer, whichever lobbyist they talk to last, to just send in 100 of these and then that will change everything. But please don't use them in the wrong way, right? We were on with Armchair Warlord, a guy that's been a military guy for about 10 years, recently left, now is in law school. And he was talking about, like, there's a reason why even, during certain conflicts in the Mideast, we didn't send them Stinger missiles, because we were terrified that, some terrorist was going to take down a plane with a U.S. Stinger. And now we're sending all kinds of weapons into Ukraine and admitting we have no idea where they end up. So the Defense Department goes back and forth on different days. And as you note, Yellen, is trying to play the game of what the State Department crowd wants. But almost everybody in the banking financial world is screaming exit, 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 exit. And so you're seeing this constant conflation and confrontation between these different sources, because they all fear the same thing. And some just are a little more clear-eyed at knowing when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen and if it's going to happen than others within our own apparatus. And as you note, it's a bad lack of the capacity of objective. I mean, what real realism requires is old school Burkean conservatism, a respect on limits, an understanding of your own limits, and an understanding of others' limits. We don't have much of that. There are very few Mearsheimers. Somebody asked in the super chat earlier about the Mearsheimer debate. I mean, McFaul is an idiot. Just follow him on Twitter. The guy's a joke. The fact that we had him as an ambassador to Russia should tell you everything you need to know about how degraded our intellectual political class is. It's just degraded. It's kind of like the Ukrainian military in the Donbass. It's just there's not a lot left that you can have confidence in. And so that's going to continue on that front. But politically, you're right. I don't see any exit for them. They thought maybe January 6th, doing these big televised hearings in the United States on January 6th. And even NBC News was tracking independent Republican sort of anti-Trump voters in outside of Reno in Nevada. And what they found was the more they talked about January 6th, the more Republican support went up, not down, but up. Because people are reminded of how nonsense it is that they're being focused on. Putin has brought up January 6th, I think, a half dozen times himself. He's like, whenever people bring up different things on Russia, he's like, well, there was a country where a bunch of people were politically rebelling, tried to voice protest inside a government building, and you've locked them all up and dropped them in a hole without even a trial for years. That's the United States of America. That's who did that with January 6th cases. So when people see that January 6th isn't going to save them, now gun control won't really save them because of the Supreme Court decision. They think Roe's reversal might help them. I think they'll find out otherwise. If you look at what's happened just a couple of weeks ago in West Texas, an 86% Mexican-American congressional district, voted for a Republican. This was Trump made massive inroads in Latino voters in the United States. And as Van Jones even noted recently, he knows no friend of his that calls themselves Latinx, right? That makes, that's the woke world. They're in this sort of fake world. They're worried about pronouns at the Pentagon. Worry about military weapons that actually work. Worry about that. Worry about accurate military strategy, not pronouns. But the fact that a Republican won that district, where even though Trump made inroads, Biden still won it by a solid margin, gives a sense for what's happening in the country. Two things are happening: massive shift against the Democratic leadership. It's really, in my view, a rejection of neoliberalism, period. That Obama just postponed that because he was personally likable. So because he was so personally likable, largely due to media inflated versions of him, because the guy's an arrogant, condescending prick. But the ordinary American thought, also America wanted to get past its racial history, and Obama personified that. But if you looked at his policies, they were never popular. And what's happening is Biden is a guy that cannot mask the unpopularity of neoliberalism, especially on display. And there's, as the comedian used to say, there's nothing worse than the Republican Party and the Democratic Party getting together. That's when you're really going to get screwed. There's nothing worse than the neocons and the neoliberals getting together. And that's what's happened under the Biden administration, best personified in the State Department with Victoria Nuland's continued resurgent presence. And Ukraine has been their baby. It's been some of the Soros NGO babies for 30 years. So people are so invested. And we're going to use Ukraine to overturn Russia, to overturn Putin, to restore it to its colonial days of the 1990s. They wouldn't call it that. They'd call it the liberal democratic days, but that's what it really was. And they can't give up on it. And even though domestically they're about to get crushed in November. You look like the turnout between the Republicans and Democrats in these primaries is predicting a unprecedented Republican win. 50 to 75 seats in the House, 5 or more seats in the Senate. Now, Republicans are really good, and Jacob Drazen likes to put it this way, and this is a classic sort of old school populist base viewpoint in America, which is the Democratic Party is the crazy party, the Republican Party is the stupid party. So that viewpoint is a commonly held view in certain parts. So you can't rule out Republicans burning themselves up. But I think that the Democrats are done. They're DOA. It's kind of like Lyndon Johnson's version of the Democratic Party in 1968 was finished, and Nixon and Watergate just postponed that. And it really neoliberalism didn't resurface and resurge until Clinton in 1992, and even then it was disguised as something it wasn't. Clinton's disguised as some form of Southern populism, border state populism. Obama disguised as, the biracial guy that just has a sweet family that just wants to do things the best for the people. But the underlying policies were never popular and still aren't. And to the question as to Trump or DeSantis in 2024, DeSantis has told people close to him he will not run if Trump runs. So unless Trump falls apart, we will have right now we'll have a Republican House, Republican Senate by 2023, and we'll have all three with a Trump White House in 2025. As I've told people, the other aspect of DeSantis is he's indictment insurance for Trump, so that he is someone who Democrats would rather face Trump than DeSantis, is their view. So that means they won't actually, they'll talk big in the January 6th committees about Trump, won't actually indict him. But that's basically where we're heading. We're heading towards a Republican sweep in 2022, and I don't see anything reversing that. The Ukraine war continues to be more politically unpopular in the country. The people that are anti-war continue to surge for the most part in various primaries and polls. And that's the reason why there's this big PR fight by the deep state. The existing established political folks, as well as the incoming folks, are thinking this turned out to be kind of a disaster. This whole Ukraine thing, it ain't quite going the way it's supposed to go, and they don't want to continue. They don't want to be on the Afghanistan, Iraq version of it. I mean, and especially you look at U.S. foreign policy, military power since the end of the Cold War. Korean War mostly failed, and you can argue partially successful, but we weren't able to go into North Korea. Not because of China, but thankfully Doug MacArthur's idea to nuke them didn't go through. People forget about old Dougie. But the Vietnam War failed. You can argue about the first Iraq War, second Iraq War definitely a failure. Syria failure, Libya failure, Sudan failure, Somalia failure, Afghanistan failure, and now the pet project for 30 years of Ukraine and the anti-Russia project failure. So bad that there's Putin in front of 80% of people representing 80% of the world's population, 80% of the world's food, 80% of the world's fuel, 80% of the world's professional soldiers, all giving him a applause for his effective victory speech about all of this. And it's ironic that we had to rely on the Ruskies to limit the effect of some of the Vander crazies of the globalists.
I'm just going to do a quick answer to a question about Boris Johnson, about whether he's scarpering off to Kiev to hide from the angry Britons, which he is, by the way. And now it's all over the British media that he's doing this, and whether he's doing that, he's trying to cling on to Prime Minister, or whether he's thinking about a post-Prime Minister job. He is trying to cling on as Prime Minister. Boris knows that when he's out, there's going to be no post-Prime Minister job for him, not unless he can turn things round in some ways. So, Boris is not looking beyond the crisis that he's brought on himself. He's trying to find a way to stay on for as long as he can, in the hope that something turns up. What I just wanted to ask is this, Robert. Firstly, two questions. One, what is going on within the Republican Party? When we last, I think, had our session, you were predicting, and you were absolutely right, that there's going to be a groundswell of opposition within the Republican Party against the war. We saw a whole new raft of senators coming out and voting against the $40 billion package. What is happening in the primaries? Who is winning? Are we seeing establishment Republicans losing to, if you like, more populist, grassroots, old-fashioned type Republicans, the old Republican Party? Is that coming back? Will there be enough of these people to sort of wrest control of Congress back from the McConnell wing? And secondly, I mean, are the Democrats panicking? What might they do in the event that, that they're really panicking? I mean, might they start some, second iteration of the pandemic and try and impose restrictions? Or what do they have any kind of plan faced with this kind of situation that we're now looking at?
So far, there's no evidence of it if it exists. I mean, it looks like January 6th was kind of, they really thought that would bail them out. It has not. It's increasingly, they're getting hammered with the reality that it won't. So much of their surprise and shock. Ukraine isn't bailing them out in ways a lot of them thought could or would. The Fed is unable to bail them out in ways they thought could happen. And so I think that if there's a plan, that nobody else is in on it so far. So I don't see, I had thought that one way was to escalate the conflict, put troops on the ground, distract from the story, maybe obtain a reversal of military outcomes. My guess is the military folks have told them that could be a disaster and don't want it to happen. So or at least some aspect of it. You have the strongest realism you'll have is like certain parts of Army intelligence. So like we interviewed Armchair Warlord, he was previously deeply in the Army, but also he said, look, if you listen to what I predict, within a couple of weeks, some intelligence group in the West will leak that this is in fact what happened. And he says this has happened about a half dozen times. That likely means they know what would happen in a military conflict or attempting escalation. So I think that they haven't thought through their plan B, just like I don't think they ever really had a military or political plan B for Russia winning the economic geopolitical side of this. Because the other thing that's been undercover is, I mean, they loved going to the UN early on. After that last vote on the Kiev suburb, where that's it. And why? Because they didn't get a majority of countries to vote yes. Now many abstained. You had that routine that always goes on in the UN, but they lost big politically consequential countries. They lost Mexico and Central America. They lost Brazil and Latin America. They lost Kenya and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Middle East and Africa, and lost Indonesia and Africa. It's like, in Asia, you couldn't lose bigger players in each of those regions. You have Biden, who's pretending he's not really going to Saudi Arabia and begging to different oil policy. The new Saudi folks are still upset about what they blame as the neoliberal wing for being anti-Saudi. Which is clearly kind of true. They're not fully anti-Saudi, but they lean on the anti-Saudi side. This is a carryover from the Obama administration that was more pro-Iran than the Trumpist regime was, and more anti-Saudi, more anti-UAE. Trump put a focus on putting together the old 1920s coalition, World War I coalition. Let's get all the royals together along with Israel, and that will be our balance of power in the Middle East against Iran and other insurgent groups. But he's going, and he's going to be on his knees begging for Saudis to help him out on oil, which the Saudis really, there's only so much they can do, and there's definitely so much they're only willing to do. The U.S. would have to reverse publicly its policy about the dude that the Washington Post writer. The fact he wrote for the Washington Post should have told people something. It's like, that's not really maybe they want to dig a little deeper. And of course, if you're on a wanted list effectively in Saudi Arabia, you probably don't go into their embassy, even if it's in Turkey. Just word of the wise. At some point, these guys are Darwin Award winners. I don't know how much sympathy is supposed to have, but he wants U.S. public reversal on things like that. Same way Venezuela wants public reversal on certain things that the U.S. won't probably give. And it's not clear either one of them can solve the problem. I mean, the amazing degree of incompetency about the oil industry the Biden administration is showing is striking. It's like, even if I'm no fan of big oil, but you have to deal with the political realities of what it takes to develop a well, to do the drilling, to how much time it takes for it to come online, the risk you have if that goes south in 5 years, so on and so forth. They seem to have no cognizance of this. They seem to just go out and stick in something and get it out and send it, right? That's not how it works. So, and I get they want to shift the narrative there. The new narrative they're going to shift to is big, greedy corporate elites are causing inflation, and we need the state to really tax them and control them. But they don't have the support in the Senate to pass anything on that. So they'll have it on gun control, but they won't have it on that. So I think it's just going to be a Republican sweep. And then within the primaries, where war is an issue. So often it isn't an issue in a lot of these primaries. Where it is, those candidates are mostly surging. Blake Masters will be the next senator from Arizona. He has issued very Trumpish statements on the conflict. Eric Greitens, despite massive hit campaigns by Karl Rove and smear campaigns by everybody, is likely going to be the next Republican senator from the state of Missouri. And he has been, again, on the same Trumpish, dovish, let's not escalate conflict in Ukraine side. Joe Kent, that will be a conflict that will probably show up in the general election because of the unique runoff system they have in the state of Washington. He's been very populist on these policies. And then if you look at the people in representative positions of power, look at whether they're increasing attention to an issue or decreasing attention to an issue. The populist side is increasing attention to Ukraine. The one-eyed McCain, Dan Crenshaw side is decreasing focus on it. So and you're seeing more criticism of Crenshaw. I mean, they came up with well, there's different phrases for it. I like one-eyed McCain because it reminds me of the one-eyed ogre, and it's very apropos for who Dan Crenshaw really is, a war whore. But you're seeing some of the people in the political space, like the Sebastian Gorkas and others that were, Yahoo for the war, start to recede as they realize they kind of screwed up. Both in terms of where the base zeitgeist was moving, but also in terms of how the war would progress. And so far, this war was never popular. It had a thin level at the top. You could get people to say, hey, let's take out Ruskies and the bad Putin and all that. But it wasn't a deep sentiment that people actually cared that they would vote on it. But as it has progressed, it's get more and more and more unpopular. And as Biden made the mistake of blaming the war for the oil, that just means people say, oh, there's a connection between my price at the grocery store, my price at the fuel tank, and your dumb policies, Biden. That's not a winner. I think there's been forgetfulness at times about what made wars popular in the home nation. Wars were popular, sometimes for moral justification, but that doesn't usually sustain itself.
No.
Historically, it's because they brought back the loot, and not we're sending the loot. There's not a lot of wars that have been popular with any domestic population where you're sending out the loot, unless it's you're seen as your own country, your own folks. So like Russians see the western or that part of eastern Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we're heading politically, and everything we predicted at the get-go in terms of what would happen in the war, economically, politically, geopolitically, militarily, and what's happening in domestic populations, as you've seen in the UK, as you've seen in the French parliamentary elections, as you've seen in just now in Bulgaria. It's what Moon of Alabama said at the get-go. He said there will be regime change because of the Russian-Ukrainian war. It just won't be in Russia that it occurred.
Absolutely. Can I just say, we are starting also in Europe to see the first signs of a revolt of the military. Now, I want to be very careful what I'm saying here. I'm not talking about coups or anything like this, but they're starting to come out and they're starting to criticize the politicians. And I mean, we had a very interesting article about 10 days ago in the Daily Telegraph by the former head of the British Army, Lord Richards, in which he said, these people who are running things now have no grasp of strategy. This is all completely wrong strategy. It's taking us down a blind alley. Now, you have to be very careful when you read these articles because obviously it's coded, but the former head of the British Army coming out essentially criticizing ministers. It's very rare for that to happen in Britain. And he only does that if he is doing it because a lot of military officers, senior military officers, are coming out and are telling him, look, Richards, this isn't going well. We've got to make known to those people who understand, that we are completely opposed to the way things are. So that's happened in Britain. but it's from what I, glimmers of what I'm getting, it's only a pale version of what's happening in France. And I don't know whether you're aware, Robert, about this debacle of the Caesar howitzers. These are incredibly sophisticated self-propelled howitzers that the French make. And they apparently supplied several to the Ukrainians. And there's now apparently clear reports that several of them, 2 of them at least, have fallen into Russian hands. There's even some mischievous claims that Ukrainian soldiers sold them to the Russians. We don't know that's true. But anyway, apparently 2 of them have been captured by the Russians, taken to the Russian laboratories, and they're being taken apart, and the Russians are finding out all about this. And again, apparently we're having rumbles from the military, which are appearing in the French equivalent of alternative media, which is quite well advanced in France, by the way. And they're saying, the military is saying, we were dead against this idea. We always said that we should never supply weapons like this to Ukraine. It would end badly. And here we are, the politicians overrode us. They went ahead, they insisted that these weapons be sent to Ukraine, and it's turned out badly, just as we said it would. And I think that you're probably, from what you told us about, the concerns within the Defense Department, both from the military industrial complex, but I suspect some people in the uniformed military in the United States are probably coming forward now and are also saying this isn't a good idea at all. We've got to draw back. We can't go on depleting our arsenals, sending weapons to Ukraine in the way that we're doing. It's dangerous. What are we going to do if we are in a crisis somewhere in the world and we're basically out of shells? What are we going to do in that kind of situation? So this has got to come to a stop. So I am sure that this is happening in the United States as well. Those military officers, those American military people that I've met from time to time, I have no doubt at all that they're the sort of people who would speak frankly to those in power and would explain those things. So I just wanted to say that I think that there's, beneath the surface, a revolt of the military, if you like, going on. They're actually strongly advising against what's happening. And I also wanted to just express my own view. Somebody asked Robert, there was a question asked Robert whether, things can be turned around in the United States. I don't know what Robert's views are about this. I have absolutely no doubt, of course they can. The United States is all that it needs to turn things around.
A lot of questions about that. A lot of questions to you, Robert, about how you're feeling. Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. If you can get the right leadership sorted out, if you start being more reasonable, rational about your policies, the problem in the United States is in its political class. And when I say the political class, I don't just mean, the politicians in Congress and in the White House. I mean the whole apparatus that sort of keeps them where they are. But if you find some way of resolving that, and in the United States you can, it's happened before, you can have this change in the United States, which has happened in the past. You've seen it happen. If you look back to, say, the appearance of the Republican Party in the past, back in the 1850s, you can see how these changes can happen in the United States. But the United States has all the means to turn things around, and people will be astonished at how fast it would happen. I mean, I'm absolutely certain of this.
The irony is we may have needed this to purge and justify a much more honest Trumpist approach, or if you don't like Trump, populist approach to what I'm describing, though I think Trump is much more than people gave him credit for on aspects of like the anti-war left crowd. They're kind of discovering. I mean, it's always funny watching, Jimmy Dore talking about, okay, here's a big war vote, and there's literally 0 Democrats voting against escalation of this conflict, and there's over 50 Republicans in the House. Now that, of course, sets off, the Young Turks crowd and the rest. Now, Jimmy Dore is a Trump apologist, along with being on Putin's payroll, like Aaron Mate and all the rest of them. They're all secretly on Putin's payroll. I guess the check just hasn't come for a while. But the that, sort of mindset and mentality. But I'm very optimistic, because this is in the same sense, like in the lockdown issues and the vaccine mandate issues and the rest. There have been core concerns with government public health power, with government military power, with government economic power. I mean, we were on pace for a global central bank-based digital currency that would have been the most powerful and potent control mechanism in the history of the world. That is dead now because of this. I mean, does anybody think anybody in Africa or Latin America or Central America or Russia or China is signing off to that? I mean, they may have their own digital currencies, but there's not going to be any global shared digital currency of any centralized institute. That is gone for a while. So there was a lot of bad things the World Health Organization trying to use it as a globalist institution to regulate not only domestic public health, but domestic economics in the name of public health. Even the proposal to try to get a treaty failed because of the public backlash. So these are fantastic outcomes. I think that populism is in the greatest place to resist globalism in maybe the history of the world. Definitely since the 1920s. I mean, in America, the last time we had a really robust populist resistance, we had, the war racketeering committees. I mean, that if we have Republicans with the cojones, that's what will come back. Have a war racketeering committee. Put all these people, a real January 6th, of people who are the real underminers and seditious actors of American tradition and history, with all these dumb wars for foolish reasons. Put all of these people on display. But I think we're moving much more in that direction. I think, even as to U.S.-Russia relations, if Trump wins in 2025, as Jackson Hinkle mentioned, I was on his show earlier this week, DeSantis is kind of an unknown person on foreign policy. There were some of us who suspected he had some neocon inclinations. We don't know. To his credit, he's mostly kept his head down. He could have grandstanded and virtue signaled like mad on Ukraine, even though he's only a governor, but he didn't. But I don't yet trust him on foreign policy. He hasn't proven himself at all on whether he's on the Trumpist side on foreign policy. Done a great job governing the state of Florida, has better personnel policy picks than Trump did when he was in the White House in implementing his actual agenda, but we still don't know where he stands on foreign policy. Until then, Trump is the better option for all the people that have legitimate questions and concerns about Trump. But I think a robust, reinvigorated populist movement Trump, which has J.D. Vance in the Senate, Blake Masters in the Senate, Eric Greitens in the Senate. Josh Hawley famously voted against the $40 billion for Ukraine. He reversed from his early position. No better symbol of what was happening with the Republican voter base than Josh Hawley goes from talking to Zelensky, this important hero, being like, no, I was never on the Ukraine train. What are you talking about? No. That was educational as to what was taking place. He would have the most robust popular support in the House and Senate ever. And I think, like, going through all of this now, like, if Trump had won re-election, we probably don't get Ukraine, but it probably just still postpones the problem, because globalists wanted to use Ukraine to provoke Russia into a conflict in order to wage economic war on them. That agenda had been there had been there since Putin's rise over the last 15 years. Trying to make Russia a colony had been a project for 30 years. There's a good Twitter thread with this young woman talking about why they don't want to bring back the 1990s in Russia, why that is a horrendous theory and outcome. And I'm sure Putin's popularity is through the roof now. I mean, you take on the entire globalist enterprise. They wage war on you economically at an unprecedented scale. They wage war on you geopolitically at an unprecedented scale. They wage war on you culturally on a global scale, and you beat them in all three. I mean, the Russian people are going to think this guy is like the second coming of Jesus. What he's been able to pull off over and over and over again. But I think I'm optimistic, because if Putin had lost, frankly, I thought it would be very bad. Because that would mean the globalists would have made a point to the whole world that they can control anybody, any place, anytime, that they can, smack them down, like smack them all anytime they stick their head up. And it's just the opposite. The globalists have been exposed as the naked emperors they are. And so consequently, very optimistic on that side, very optimistic for the U.S. I think Trump could put Putin's is the ultimate realpolitik guy. You know, you've seen him be right at odds with somebody, and a year later, no problem. How's everything going? All's cool. So, I mean, Russia's had its problems with China. Didn't stop him from aligning with him when necessary and beneficial to Russia as he sees it. Anywhere in the world, he's done that. I mean, he would meet with Americans that called him, murderers. So this is he can look past all of those things. So I think Russia-U.S. relations could dramatically reverse if there was a true commitment reflected in real policy by someone. Like if a Trumpish administration comes in and there's still sanctions in existence, reverse all the sanctions, send all the money back as one good faith gesture. I mean, what John Bolton said Trump was going to do, he should do. As soon as he comes back, here's the game changer that could put U.S.-Russia relations back on a normalized scale for the very many common issues we have in common between our two nations. I mean, Russians, I describe them as they're just East Tennessee, a little bit east. If you understand East Tennessee, you're not surprised when you see Russians having bears as pets, right? None of this mindset surprises. They're not going to run and desert like everybody was saying was happening in Ukraine. It's like, that doesn't happen. But once you understand that, one of the great things Trump could do is do what he's talked about doing in 2016. Pull us out of NATO. Just pull us out. We can do it unilaterally. Just come in and say, Europe is your problem, not our problem. We're out of NATO. Yeah. And then NATO's kind of a toothless tiger for all of its big talk. I mean, I get there was the other British general who's like, we must prepare for war with Russia on the ground. Somebody tell the British military you couldn't even beat the Germans when the Russians were on your side by yourselves. You're going to beat the Russians? No, you're not going to beat the Russians. Not unless you got Uncle Sam, right, bailing you out again. And I think Trump's point is we bailed out Europe twice. Twice is enough. Time to quit being involved. We see what NATO gives us. NATO gives us wars like Ukraine. NATO gives us economic sanctions. NATO gives us economic turmoil. NATO gives us a Russia-China alliance that's stronger than ever before. NATO loses American economic dominance. Time to get out of NATO. NATO's never, what good has NATO done in its entire history? But at least from an American perspective, I don't see any, and not for the American people. So if Trump went in and said, no more sanctions, we're out of NATO, I think U.S.-Russia relations could repair very rapidly. Now, I don't think Russia will ever trust the West again in terms of meaningful investment that they couldn't pull out of. But I do think you could heal most U.S.-Russia relations pretty quickly if you just took smart strategic actions that a Trump 2025 could do.
I completely agree. I follow Russian media fairly closely, and I'm going to say straight away, it's been very, very interesting to see how the Russians, and this isn't just Putin, by the way, this is a sort of general, the population to a great extent, the media, certainly the political class in Russia, they make a clear distinction now between Europe and the United States. Now, they understand that the United States is an adversary, that it's a great power. It makes these decisions. We have to withstand them, but we don't feel the contempt and the anger for the Americans that we have for the Europeans. And this has been a major thing about the Russians, because they've seen the attitude to them in Europe. They've seen what Europeans really think of Russia. And they've decided, look, we're not having anything more to do with these people again. But when it comes to the Americans, well, they're a great power. We understand what they're about. If they change their policy, well, we will reflect that too. And again, in that speech at Spieth, there's a very interesting passage that Putin had. He was talking about how there's been this extreme money printing, how the United States, Western countries went into money printing. And he gave an example of how that's been damaging, how it's sucked goods from all over the world into the United States, into the West, and how that's undermined, it's hollowed out ultimately the economies of the West and specifically of the United States. And he gave a very interesting example. He said, not so long ago, the United States was the breadbasket of the world. That was the country that exported food. And now it imports food. And the achievement that the United States had as a great food exporter is something that Americans were rightly, justly proud of, and we should learn from it. Now, that was actually, if you think about it, it was very complimentary about the United States. Not, of course, the United States of today, which is clearly, from his point of view, and not just from his point of view, from many Russians' point of view, gone astray. It's taken a disastrously bad and wrong turn. But it shows, again, an underlying attitude to the United States. And there's nothing said anywhere in Putin's speech which is complimentary about anything at all about Europe.
Yeah, and no surprise. I mean, the other thing, Trump, if Trump is serious and wants his policies, his instinct to be reflected in what actually happens, he needs to not only change his personnel appointment pattern, but we need to purge large parts of the State Department, CIA, FBI, aspects of the Defense Department. I mean, we have an administrative state that is bloated. And we just need to, one way you can fire people protected by civil service reform is you just eliminate their positions. And there's a bunch, we have positions that people just don't need those positions. Just scratch them, scrap them, get rid of them, done them. Because the administrative state, the professional managerial class that has governed us in one way, shape, or form in much of the world in the last century has proven to be utter abominable failures, abysmal failures. I mean, the EU project is a failure. The West post-Cold War politics globally is a failure. I mean, where we can point to and say the world's better off because we stuck our nose in over here. You can make arguments on the Balkans if you're on the Croatian side of the aisle, but not when you counterbalance with the problem still in Bosnia, the problem still in Kosovo, and you developed a real hatred in Serbia and parts of Russia because of what you did and how you handled it. Obviously, Libya is not, you can't point to that. Like if you put up a resume of the deep state or national security establishment or globalist or neoliberals, neocons, whatever label you want to put on them, you put up a resume, it's just one it's somebody that has to leave everything off their resume. They have to, it's like those resumes you get that I worked from this time for 1 year and all of a sudden they didn't, like the resume disappears for like the next 6 years. And you're like, the first thing you think is, what happened there? It's right. It's all the employers are trying to hide, people they don't want you to talk to. That would be the deep state resume, right? I mean, it'd be, okay, we had a little success here in 1990. Let's skip. Well, that's it, really. I mean, if you call going into Panama and taking out our boy Noriega, who had been our boy for like 50 years, a success. I mean, but that's as good as it gets. The Kuwaiti emir is feeling good. Okay, if that's a success, I mean, our success is tiny and our failures are off the charts. It's time to reassess.
Yes, the reason America's adventures go wrong, I mean, they're not America's adventures, first of all. They're the adventures of a particular faction within the political class. But if you're trying to run the world, which is what these people are trying to do, there is no amount of resources you can ever find which will be enough to enable you to achieve your objectives. Because resources are finite, resources of men, materials, money, whatever. But you're going to try to run the world, then the demands on your resources are going to be infinite. And given that that's the case, inevitably, you're going to have one failure after another. You can't just go to places like Iraq, Vietnam, Afghanistan, wherever, and expect to succeed, unless, of course, you have a particular imperative military reason in any particular war that you fight to actually fight it. War is not something, that you should ever undertake frivolously, and certainly not for, a ludicrous ideology of, trying to run everybody everywhere all the time, which is exactly what the United States used to know extremely well. I mean, you always come up, Robert, with this thing that this statement of John Quincy Adams about the United States not going around the world, looking for monsters to slay because it might become a monster itself. That was an understanding, ultimately, of the limits of power. people of that generation, the generation of the founders, and the founding generation. And by the way, I think I'm right in saying that Lincoln used to talk a lot about the founding generation. That was very much, if my memory serves me right, part of his speeches. But anyway, they understood that. They understood that very well, and so did the United States for most of its existence. And it was always very restrained in its foreign policy. The other thing that I was like, a good example of, the old America, the real America, if you like, is Henry Stimson, who was, of course, Secretary of State and Secretary of War. He was Secretary of War before the First World War, and then he became Secretary of State. And he was, I think, a sort of Republican, but maybe a rather liberal Republican, and he served with Roosevelt. Anyway, he becomes Secretary of State in 1929, and he closes down the cipher department, which is reading, deciphering the cables, the embassy cables of other countries. And he says, "Gentlemen don't read each other's mail." And that's said by the Secretary of State of the United States. And today, the United States has gone so far from that kind of philosophy that you have the NSA, the CIA, you have this massive, bloated intelligence service, which, what would Henry Stimson have said about that? So there has been a radical shift in the way that America has been operating over the last few decades. And it's not rooted, despite, because I get criticized when I say this, but it's not rooted in America's past. It's a diversion from it.
Oh, absolutely. And so, I think that, and this is put on full display. One utility to all going through all of this is it's like the question about a second pandemic. Could that bail them out? Biden, of course, can't stay on script, so he kind of slipped up. He's like, "Oh, I need money for the next pandemic. It's coming." It's like, what? They tried with monkeypox. That didn't sell well, public marketing wise. Now there was talk of polio. Polio's back in the UK and is about to spread.
Absolutely.
That routine. I think the problem is they exposed themselves in this agenda at every level. That people became educated at how they misuse a public health crisis, that they will inflate and exaggerate the dangers of it for the purposes of seizing power. Yeah. That's problem one, that people around the globe now are much more alert, much more awake to that risk than they were in 2020 when this all started. They understand 2 weeks to slow the curve will be 2 years to screw your rights. But the other aspect is the economic aspect. The reason why they can't really go back to that is that their premise was a version of modern monetary theory, which was you can just print your own money and solve your own problems at core. It's more complicated than that. So not, being fully dismissive of it, but at core, that's a big part of its premise. In practical terms, they're learning. Europe and the US is learning. Oh, you know what? This doesn't work. Because we now have massive inflation problems that we can't cure, that no public policy will cure. They pretended they were transitory. They're not. And so the net effect of it is, how can they do another pandemic set of lockdowns when we can't economically recover from the last ones, when we're still suffering from it now? And especially in the US, where disposable income is critical because we have a consumption-driven rather than manufacturing or service-driven economy. We need that excess capital from housing sales and equity values and stock market equity to make that consumer economy work. What happens if we implode the housing market? Plenty of people are saying there's going to be a 50%, especially people that are on the big short side of the aisle, like Michael Berry, is predicting a 50% drop in the stock market within the next 2 years. As much as a 50% or bigger drop is being predicted in the housing market. Because the only thing the raising interest rates has clearly impacted has not been consumer inflation. It's been the stock market and the housing market. In just 2 years, the cost to an ordinary American to buy a home has almost doubled on a monthly basis between the interest rate increases and inflated values in the housing market that are worsened by supply chain problems. What happens if the housing market collapses? What happens if the stock market collapses.
Mm.
Doesn't the consumer market of the U.S. go with it? And that's where Putin's point, going back to the very beginning of this, that Kissinger ultimately has maybe himself has realized that that if you control food, you control countries. If you control fuel, you control continents. If you control currency, you control the globe. He was wrong on the third part, because the currency only matters depending on how much food and fuel you have. And that was, Putin. If folks out there read or listen to that speech, it sounds exactly like what we talked about all the way back at the beginning. Not only previewing what Putin was thinking, but also that this is where the reality is, which is, he said, this is illusory. There's an illusory value versus the real value. And the illusory economy, the illusory power, the illusory society, they lost, because it turns out the real world is what matters. Who has the food? Who has the fuel? Who has the things that make goods, which is often reliant upon food, fertilizer, or fuel itself, is who really governs the world. And and given that success and the globalist failure is the political reality we face currently, but there are certain parts of the U.S. and the West that still have not come to terms with it. Like when their reaction to Putin's victory speech, de facto victory speech, he didn't give it like Trump. Like I was telling somebody, someone should take Putin's speech and imagine Trump giving it, and where it would flare up. I mean, it would be a little more. It would be more humorous. It would be more derogatory of the West, and more celebratory of himself. It was like when Trump was just doing something on Biden. He's like, he did it as if it was sad. He was like, he can't ride a bike, folks. He can't ride a bike. He can't ride it. Like it was some day of mourning or something. It's his subtle, flat style of humor. Putin could have done a lot of that. He didn't in his speech, but the rest of it reads like what we were talking about. And that is a massive global shift in perception of power. It may have always been what power really was. But Africa is seeing it, Latin America is seeing it, Central America is seeing it, Asia is seeing it. And there instead, our sad globalist reaction was, let's escalate in Kaliningrad instead. Now, the question is, if NATO fell apart, to that, I think it was a super chat question, do we want Germany to rearm itself, or are we still scared that an armed up Germany looks bad? If NATO was gone.
Well, if NATO was, I mean, that by the way, that's a good question. That's a very good question, because this goes back now to the early history of the Cold War, because the reality, which was never formally admitted, which is widely known, was that in the early 50s and 40s, the Soviets were not actually so sorry to see NATO, because the very last thing they wanted, the thing that really spooked them, the thing they were really scared about, is an independent, rearmed Germany with nuclear weapons. And given that they just fought a world war against them, far better that the Germans were, under the control of the US, under the thumb of the US via NATO, than that they were, once again independent, trying to get nuclear weapons. And by the way, the German Chancellor of the 1950s, he actually did want to get nuclear weapons. The Konrad Adenauer, he actually wanted Germany to acquire nuclear weapons. And of course, as you can imagine, the Russians utterly freaked out at that idea, and basically Eisenhower put a stop to it. So I mean, this is an untold story about the early Cold War, but it is a fact that we think of the early Cold War as a US-Russia, US-Soviet conflict, but there were actually, even then, there was sort of beneath the surface, there was sort of shared convergences which are not widely understood. What about today? I think that the Russians would certainly not be pleased if Germany rearmed and acquired nuclear weapons. But I think the Russians are looking at the situation in Germany today, and I think they're saying to themselves, ultimately, the way the Germans are running things, we're not really especially afraid of these people. It's not the same Germany that we fought way back in the 40s, and which still seemed to be potentially major power in the 1950s and 1960s. It's got severe demographic problems, even worse in some ways than our own. And we've got demographic problems. We know all about that, but we've got plans to deal with that. Germany's problems are even worse. And it's got gathering economic problems of a kind that would undermine Germany in the long term even more. On balance, NATO now is a real problem. It's been hijacked by its ultras. The Green Party in Germany is able to manipulate it. The Baltic states, to some extent, are as well. The British, too. It's leading us into all kinds of confrontations. It's created this new crisis in Kaliningrad, which is going to continue and persist beyond the problems of the Ukraine, once even after Ukraine's been sorted. Better get NATO out of the way, then we can talk with all these countries directly. We don't have to face all this time this false, this fake Euro-Atlantic solidarity that is just always means that whoever is most critical of us always in the end prevails. So we can talk with these countries, we can cut deals with them, and we can move forward. NATO at the moment is standing in the way of that. I think that is the predominant view in Russia today, to say it frankly.
Now, do you think the Germans are starting to wake up to the recognition at any level? Because it appears that there's still very little recognition outside of the business community. Kind of the genius of the Schroeder-Putin deal, which was Germany would be a consistent consumer of natural gas from Russia. And in exchange, Schroeder would be able to satiate momentarily the Greens by shutting down nuclear power, limiting coal power. But also what he was really doing was giving a reliable, cheap source of energy to German industry to give them a key market edge around the globe. And it appears they're not really processing the benefits of that deal by walking away from the deal, such that Schroeder's persona non grata in parts of Germany. And now, I mean, they're lighting back up the coal plants, which is kind of funny. The Greens are, coal, that you're for coal now. That's interesting. But it's going to be interesting to see where they get that coal. I mean, that's the old Putin joke from years ago. They're like, okay, they don't want our natural gas, so they want logs, they want wood. Where do they think they're going to get that? Coal. They want coal. Where do they think they're going to get that? The whole crowd's laughing in Russia. But do you think that was, I thought, a genius deal by both sides. It gave Germany a great economic edge. It gave Russia a reliable early consumer of necessary resources to rebuild its economy. And they've blown that up without a replacement.
Absolutely. And on the subject of coal, can I just say, of course, that Germany imported most of its, or at least a large part of its thermal coal from Russia. And if you know anything about the coal industry, which of course these people probably don't, you can't just reopen coal mines. It's an enormously complex thing to do. You can't even just reopen coal-fired power stations. I mean, this isn't simple technology. You don't just, it's not like, you put your coal in a fireplace and light it, and it generates heat. It doesn't work like that. So it's not straightforward at all. Now, do the Germans understand this? There's two fundamental things to understand about Germany. Firstly, one very obvious thing, if you spend any time there, which is that the media in Germany is terrible. It always speaks with one voice. It always has a very strong Euro-Atlantic voice, even more so than in the US or in Britain, believe it or not. Anybody in Germany, any political leader who wants to break policies, change the policies, he's got to swim against the tide of a media that can be both pretty hysterical, in my experience, and which is, as I say, pretty monolithic as well. So that's a problem. But, German politicians have done it in the past. They could presumably do it again. Problem about Germany is that it's a pretty decentralized place that tends to encourage pretty provincial thinking within the German political class. you need strong parties to basically overcome that, because otherwise politics, as I said, tends to flow to the regions. Parties in Germany recently have been very weak. The political structures in Germany have been weakened, in my opinion, to an extreme degree by the long rule of Angela Merkel, who always, cut down anybody who looked like they might be strong and might be a rival to her. So it's not going to be very easy to break with these policies now, despite the fact that, in my opinion, there are millions of people in Germany. I don't just mean the business elite, but there are millions of people in Germany who deep down disagree with the direction that is being taken. And I hear that the popularity of the German government is collapsing, which doesn't surprise me. But again, and it's the same problem in Britain, there isn't a clear alternative. It's not as if in Germany, outside, the AfD, which does exist and is a force and might get stronger, but within the traditional political class, it's not as if there's anybody who can obviously come forward and say, look, this is not working. We must find another way. I mean, in time, no doubt, such a political force, it might be the AfD, might emerge, but it will take a long time to happen. In France, they started to rebel against this 20 years ago. And it's only now that we've got into a situation where the left and the right are challenging the globalist Europeanist centre in the National Assembly. It's taken a long time to work out in France, and France is a much less controlled society in that respect than Germany is.
Some people had asked me about where we think the war ends territorially in Ukraine. I'm still inclined, despite the escalation efforts of the EU and of NATO in the West, I still think he sticks to the traditional historical Russian regions, in part because that's, there's historical tradition there, but most importantly because of the current population. That if he stays in the South and the East, he has areas that voted for the pro-Russian candidate in all the past Ukrainian elections. He has a lot of Russian language speaking groups. He'll have minimal domestic internal opposition. Because, like, when you go back to, some people were arguing about why Ukraine could succeed in Russia was look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Syria, look at Vietnam. It was like, well, if you look at it militarily, it wasn't the U.S. military or the NATO allies or the rest lost, or European governments lost militarily in a lot of these places like Vietnam, like Afghanistan, like Iraq. They lost because they never had political support of the populace, and you couldn't militarily impose it upon them. That was the primary reason they failed. They failed because South Vietnamese government was not anything the Vietnamese people had much interest in because of how corrosively corrupt it was. Similarly with Afghanistan, it was corrupt, crony government that nobody believed in. Obviously dubious. It's like that dude in Venezuela who keeps pretending to be president. That guy. It's those kind of people. I think Putin will stay out of parts of Ukraine that right now, because of 20 years of Russian hatred in Ukraine, don't want anything to do with Russia, particularly the western part. So I could see the incentive and the motivation, and Scott Ritter and other people have talked about the symbolism of going into Lviv and tearing down the Stepan Bandera statue, etc. I just don't think Putin wants the headache of managing people who don't want the Russians there. I do think they'll go into Odessa. I thought that early on and went back and forth just because of Putin's speech, where he's like, we know who the bad people are in Odessa, and they're going to pay a price. I was like, well, the only way you do that for sure is if you go into Odessa. So at least by inference. So I think that the Ukraine won't cut a deal. So they're still locked into that alignment and living in their own fantasy world. So I think they'll clean up in the Donbass, first go up to Kharkiv, which won't be easy. There's a lot of troops there. It's urban warfare, a lot of conflict. But I think they will take Kharkiv, and then I think they'll go and take a little bit more north of the river and just east of the Dnieper River up to the rest of those oblasts, including Mykolaiv. And then they'll go over into Odessa. The other advantage is that gives them geopolitical edge. So one, they have a controllable population that will be mostly supportive of them being there in most of the regions, not as clear in Odessa, but most likely. Second, they're in historically Russian areas. Third, they have the benefit of control of the northern side of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, protection for Crimea, protection for the other for Transnistria, which they could then bridge on that side of the aisle and solve that problem, kill two birds with one stone. And last but not least, it's where the heart of agriculture is in Ukraine, is in this same region. The heart of industrial resources is in this region. The heart of manufacturing base is in this region. And let the Poles deal with pretending they're rebuilding the Polish-Lithuanian Empire and manage the problem of everything west of Kiev. I still think that's where they go. I can see why there'd be temptation because of what's happening with Kaliningrad. One way to solve that would be to at least go up to that part of the country, unite with Belarus, bring it down so you don't have to deal with Lithuania anymore. I could see incentives for aspects of that, but I still think he doesn't want to manage a bunch of people that don't want him there, that don't want Russia there. I think he wants to avoid that if at all possible. So I think he stays with that other region and he gets most of what he would want in terms of land, population, national security, geopolitical, economic interest, cultural alignment, etc. But what do you guys think?
My views on this with this situation, and I do sometimes wonder whether Putin himself is clear. Now, I've been listening to him. I was reading his statements. I noticed again that he's extremely careful at the moment when he talks about the war in Ukraine to talk about the war in Donbass rather than in Ukraine. In other words, that does, it seems to me, point to limited objectives. Now, to be very clear, they're going to go beyond Donbass. We know that for a fact because Russian officials have been handing out passports in Kherson region, in Zaporozhye, in Kharkiv. I mean, clearly it's going to go beyond Donbass, and they wouldn't be doing all those things without Putin say so. And those same officials, and we're talking about government officials, have been going and reassuring people, yes, we are here to stay. If you get your passport, your Russian passport, no, we are not going to hand you over back to Ukraine. So I don't think he's actually going to limit it to Donbass, which I think would be politically impossible now. But the fact that he's talking about Donbass does strongly suggest that he's going to limit himself, or that he's still thinking about limiting himself to Russian-speaking regions. And you're absolutely right. If you take those regions, I saw somebody, it might even have been a map that you sent us, Robert, but I mean, I read somewhere that those regions actually count for something like 80% of Ukraine's productive GDP. So, I mean, we're talking about, a massive reduction in the power of the Ukraine that's left. So, that argues strongly in favor of him limiting the scope of the operation to those Russian regions. The other thing, and which also argues for this, is Putin's own life experiences. He was in Germany, in East Germany, in 1989. He saw the protests there. There's been lots of discussion and stories about what Putin actually thought about that. In fact, it's not difficult because, again, he's essentially said that. He said that the big lesson he took from that is that Russia should never go where it's not wanted. So, I mean, that was a formative experience for him, and it could probably apply to Ukraine as well. I think what might argue against it is two things. Firstly, if there is a Ukrainian collapse, perhaps especially in central Ukraine, and the Russians may feel, well, maybe if we move into central Ukraine, there may not be very much resistance to us there. After all, we were all part of the same country for a very long time. Putin does talk from time to time about Russians and Ukrainians really being one nation. Maybe if there's no real resistance to the Russians, after the military collapses. That might persuade him and some people in Moscow, well, maybe we should move there. I think a much bigger reason, a much more important factor, if they really do decide to move further west, would be the policies of the Western powers. If Putin and the leadership in Moscow were to say, well, look, if we stop at the Dnieper, if we just take southeastern Ukraine, it may account for Ukraine's a bulk of its GDP. But if we leave a rump Ukraine, that will simply join up with NATO. It will rearm, may not be economically very successful, but it'll be very, very hostile to us. It will be rearmed by NATO. We might start to see, missiles and nuclear weapons being deployed there, and that would be dangerous for us. So I think it's something where perhaps Putin hasn't finally made his mind up. I think his instincts are to do very much what you said, to go so far, stick to the Russian-speaking areas, places that will integrate easily back into Russia, which would be a stable part of Russia. It would not be a place where you'd get resistance, where people would reliably vote for the United Russia Party. I mean, let's not forget, he's a politician as well. He wants to, if not remain in power himself, he wants to preserve his own, the political system that he's created. Stop there. Don't bring in other parts of Ukraine. They don't really want us there. If we bring them in, they'll just be a headache for us. I think that's his instinct, but he's looking beyond that. He's probably going to be looking beyond that. He's going to look at the way the international situation evolves. He's going to look at the situation, the way the situation in Ukraine itself evolves. And the one thing we can say about Putin is that he's an incredibly flexible leader. He will adapt his policies to the changing situation. He's very fluid. He will not box himself in. But I think his instincts are to do what you said. Take the Russian-speaking areas and then stop.
I think all that makes sense. I think the other aspect is whether or not does Western Europe really want to absorb the responsibility of a rump Ukraine. I mean, we're already seeing the conflict in the immigration context. It was like when the immigration blew up in 2015 and you had this massive wave of really NATO-caused wars triggering it, but Afghanistan, Pakistan being added to by Libya, Syria, parts of Iraq, etc. And the West, particularly the Nordic countries and the Dutch, were already having trouble with often first-generation migrants or first-generation children of migrants in terms of political, cultural, economic conflict in those countries. And then we saw it blow up again. But we're seeing a repeat of it in Ukraine, because I think there was this perception almost that these were, that Western Ukraine and the places that were flooding with refugees into Europe were really very, very European, as opposed to, this Ukraine has spent 10 years celebrating hooligan culture by rewarding them in powers of militia, the National Guard, etc. When you have a culture like that, is that a culture that's really going to blend in real easily, economically, socially, politically in Western Europe? Instead, the Poles found a pretext to kick him out by saying, well, we need to deport you for the purposes of serving the Ukrainian military. But, hey, we're all brothers, Poles were pretty quick to send the Ukrainian men right back across the border. You have problems in other parts where, in some of the Nordic countries, they're explaining to Ukrainian women they need to dress differently to deal with the other issues of Muslim migrant populations for trying to reduce sexual assault and other problems that are occurring. Then you got, my favorite story, like the British story, where the guy brings in the Ukrainian woman and she married and she gets him to divorce her, separate from his wife and marry the Ukrainian. You can guess the only U.S. place that, in Europe, you're seeing signs in stores saying Ukrainians not welcome. The press is kind of suppressing it, but it's starting to pop up in different places. So this is not such an easy cultural blend as I think the EU types thought it would be. But again, these are the same people that thought Libyan Libyans would just easily blend into German culture and other places. Like, maybe not so much. The way I always put it is do it in reverse. For the people out there that see that as racism or religious bigotry, just imagine if you took a bunch of Brits from Birmingham and sent them to the middle of Iraq. Do you think that they're going to blend in real easily? These are very different cultures formed over a long time period with very different lifestyles and belief structures, et cetera. It's just not going to be a natural blend. It's kind of like Trump meeting the Queen. It's going to be it's interesting and entertaining, but not necessarily the most natural event. So, I do wonder. In the U.S., there was one place where we are advertising Ukrainian applications welcome right here in Vegas. They even got a billboard for it. Take a wild guess what that place is.
Yeah. Well,
it's known for women who dress in a certain way and dance in a certain way.
Yeah. I mean, can I just say, in Britain, right at the start of this crisis, with all the media spreading all the stories about heroic Ukraine, you saw quite a few Ukrainian flags appearing in windows in homes, and people sticking the windows, and lots of solidarity for Ukraine, and protests in support of Ukraine, pop singers singing songs in support of Ukraine, and all that kind of. That seems to have faded. I mean, it seems to have completely dwindled away. So I think there's been a mood shift, and I think that perhaps, quite possibly, there wouldn't be a great, welcoming of Ukraine into the bosom of Europe or whatever. But of course, that's what the population of Europe may feel. It might also be the right thing to do. But the bureaucracy in Brussels has an entirely different agenda. What they want is relentless and continuous expansion. And I think nobody in their senses would want to take Ukraine. I mean, it's a basket case already. After the war, it'd be an even bigger basket case. And it's probably not good for Ukraine to do that either. But, if you're Ursula von der Leyen, these considerations don't apply to you. Your policy is more Europe all the time. More Europe internally. You want to integrate and centralize and control everything. And of course, more Europe in terms of the territory that you expand into. So ultimately, eventually, this more Europe thing is going to crash into the buffers. I mean, it's economically senseless. But at the moment, one has to say it's the Ursula von der Leyens who are in control. I mean, you only have to look at the oil the ban on Russian oil. It made no economic sense. Even Janet Yellen told them not to do it. Don't do it. This is a mistake. It's going to be bad for us. It's going to create more inflation. And of course, Ursula von der Leyen wanted it. The Brussels bureaucracy wanted it, partly because it gives them an opportunity to meddle in the economic policies of the member states. It gives them a whole new area which they can directly control. And so, even though it made no sense and it's created lots of economic problems, they went ahead and did it. And they're now going to grant candidate status to Ukraine. They've made all kinds of promises to Ukraine. Well, candidate status doesn't mean very much. Turkey, I think, acquired it in 1964, and it's still waiting. But the very fact that they did it, I mean, does show the sort of way in which these people think.
I can't. I actually forgot von der Leyen's last name because I just think of Alex as von der Crazy.
Everybody does.
She's now the last name. To the super chat question. I mean, you guys have always had made the quote or referenced the quote. The point of NATO was to keep America in, Russia out, and Germany down. And I could see. I mean, if you wanted a conspiracy theory like about Germany related to this, it would be that it's meant to crush Germany. I mean, the Schroeder-Poten deal that helped give Germany a major industrial edge with a permanent cheap supply of fuel, they are completely erasing and reversing, which means severe damage to a wide range of German industry for which it may never recover. I mean, when your leader can be, what does he call him? A liver sausage, that Ukrainian foreign minister?
Sulky liver. Yeah, sulky liver sausage.
Sulky liver sausage. Where's the German sense of pride? You don't want the misplaced version of German pride for sure. But to that theory of the super chat question, you can't rule it out. It is a little odd that Canada didn't know how to fix this and somehow thought it was a sanctions issue to be able to do this. But it would be a bit of a surprise. And it also makes you wonder whether this would have happened, for all of my criticisms of Merkel, whether this would have happened when she was in charge. You know what I mean? Because she at least was good at looking out, for the most part, for Germans' interests. She notoriously screwed over Ukraine, so did it, smiling on the way out. And it's amazing the political class in Germany is so weak now, so incompetent, so inept, that with its businessmen begging, please don't do this, they just keep marching blindly in. To the super chat question, you probably can't rule it out.
Absolutely. Well, can I just say, the reason the political class in Germany is so weak, well, there's many reasons. As I've said many times, the European centre doesn't like strong governments. By definition, it doesn't. So it weakens governments wherever it can. And with power becoming increasingly centralized in Europe, in the bureaucracy, that is inimical to real politicians emerging, because the way you exercise power in Europe is not through pleasing your electorate, it's through pleasing the apparatus in Brussels. So that already weakens the whole political system. But the other thing about Germany, and the reason the political system in Germany now is so weak, is because Merkel deliberately made it so. The point about Merkel, and I agree, by the way, she would never have allowed this to happen. If she'd been around, we would probably not have had a war. I'm absolutely sure. And she would have, been a block on sanctions and all of those things. But she deliberately created a political system in Germany which can only function with Angela Merkel as Chancellor. Because without Angela Merkel as Chancellor, it just doesn't work. Now she's gone, and you can see it doesn't work. Because, of course, that was the way in which she remained Chancellor for as long as she did. Merkel was a most interesting political leader. She had extraordinary political skills. I may have disliked the person intensely, but tracking her and following what she did, she knew exactly how to keep power both in Germany and in Europe. But the system that she created was one that could only work with her in charge. So that's where we are now. Going back, and this is an important point, and it goes back to the earlier discussion that we had about, the famous quote, about NATO being set up to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Now, that was said by Lord Ismay, who was the first NATO Secretary General, and he was, of course, British. Now, the important thing to understand about that, and this isn't complicated, it's well known. If you go into the British history, it's very clear. Far and away, the most important part of that was keeping the Americans in. Britain itself was no longer the great power. Of course, in 1948, when I think he said that, Britain still had an empire, but it was all cracking and crumbling, and Britain couldn't do it. So the British needed to have the Americans in, and the Americans working with them in order to continue to basically exercise power in Europe and globally, and also, and this is very important, not to be underestimated, to preserve their own social system. And so that was why you kept the Americans in. It was harnessing American power to British interests. That's how Britain came through the Second World War. You're absolutely right. We couldn't have defeated the Germans by ourselves. We certainly couldn't fight the Russians by ourselves. Inconceivable that we could do any of those things. If it had just been us and the Russians fighting the Germans, well, the Russians would have won, and we'd have become a satellite of Russia. And of course, that was Stalin's Soviet Union, and it's understandable why we wouldn't want to be dwarfed by that. But, quite apart from anything else, we don't really like the Russians very much. There are, people at the other end of Europe, and, they're different from us. So we don't want them. We want the Americans. We want the Americans with us in Europe because we can control to some extent. They talk our language. Their elites are deeply attracted to our culture. The whole Ivy League preppy thing, they're imitating the way our aristocrats dress. They have, they set up clubs, they do imitation public schools, they do all of those things. Their universities are made to look like ours. So we can control the Americans. They're enormously powerful, they're enormously rich, they have all that power and all that wealth, which we no longer do. And they've got powerful armed forces. So we need to keep the Americans in. That's the most important part of this. And it's still the case today. Now, it always baffles me that Americans don't understand this.
Well, I mean, it's a big reason why MI6, as part of the Five Eyes, was deeply embedded in various aspects of Russiagate and laundering illicit intel that took place and spying against Trump, was the fear that he would be a deviant voice on this precise subject and topic, because America would no longer lend its wealth for the purposes of British political elites' agenda and aspirations. That's why Christopher Steele, it's not surprising, an ex-MI6 guy, where does it connect? Britain, Ukraine, and Trump, U.S., right? That's the unholy triangle that Russiagate, Spygate was all about. And Chris Steele, ex-British MI6, working in his main clientele connected to Ukraine, spreading disinformation in the United States. And so, I mean, the Brits probably should have thought about certain aspects before Liz Truss told people to go over there and be mercs, because now they're begging the Ruskies to handle the POW issue. What's interesting is a good point by Jacob Drazen. The Russians finally clarified what was a Russian POW versus a Donetsk or Luhansk POW. And they went from saying there's about 10,000 or so Ukrainian POWs without clarifying in whose custody. And it looks like the way Russia has solved some of the, their official position is still mercenaries are not POWs. I disagree with them entirely on that interpretation of the Geneva Convention, but c'est la vie. But they've kind of dodged the issue by shifting it to Donetsk, by saying, well, we actually only have 6,500 POWs, as Jacob Drazen pointed out. And suddenly it's like where the rest are, by implication, much of the Azov battalion is going to be considered legally in the custody of two republics that are not signatories to the Geneva Convention, that the rest of the Western world refuses to even recognize their existence. So now those British mercs are in the custody of the Donetsk People's Republic. And of course, you can anticipate them getting a death penalty sentence for their crimes. Now, my own view is, I mean, politically, it's a smart move legally because the Donetsk is outside of Geneva Convention control. I don't think it's a good idea to start scrapping the Geneva Convention, period. So I still oppose what Russia's doing. I oppose what Donetsk is doing. I think we're all better off we treat everybody as POWs. Now, it is true that for crimes that pre-exist this particular war, you can, and there's an argument that prior to Russia's involvement, that these are just people who committed crimes or crimes they committed outside of the context of the military conflict, that then they have complete legal authority. But they haven't asserted that as their basis, at least that I have seen. Their asserted basis is mercenaries get no protection, and these people aren't even in Russian custody. They're in Donetsk custody. I still, am not a big fan of that approach because I like a robust Geneva's convention. But again, Ukraine has been far more egregious at committing war crimes in a documented way so far in this conflict. And really going back 8 years that they've been committing I mean, to get a bunch of weapons and the first thing you do is bomb maternity wards and residential neighborhoods, you're not a serious actor, in my view. It's something that serves no military purpose. It's not like the Russians are going to remove their military troops from one section to another just to reward you for doing it. Instead, they're more likely to escalate and it will increase the unpopularity to the degree you could in Russia for what Ukraine is and what they've done. But I think that legally still have the same position. I would like everybody in this conflict to be presumed to be a prisoner of war. That's the Geneva Convention requirement, presumption that they're a prisoner of war until proven otherwise in a judicial proceeding, rather than treat them as common criminals. I think Ukraine is absolutely wrong in what they're doing. As the earlier Super Chat said, when Merrick Garland's coming over to punish war crimes. Now, of course, every country has legal authority to a certain degree to punish war crimes under the Geneva Convention. It's the interpretation. It's just rarely done. Mostly that these international bodies have done it. Now, I'm not a fan of those either. The International Criminal Court, complete joke, proven itself to be nothing more than political hacks serving partisan causes. They had an opportunity to prove their independence and impartiality in the Yugoslav-Serbian conflict. They proved just the opposite. They've been even more egregious in this conflict. I mean, you have ICC people on the ground in Kiev already drawing presumptions of guilt about certain incidents, and it's unilaterally one way, blames the Russians. And where is the West complaining about Ukrainians? Because they're continuing, Ukraine is prosecuting more and more Russian soldiers for acts that clearly took place in the context of the war, for acts that were clearly authorized by the military at some level, their supervisors, and they're prosecuting them as common criminals in Ukraine. And I'm seeing no commentary from the legal West about this. This is a more egregious threat than how you handle the controversial question of mercenaries when you have a republic and a country kind of aligned and the republic's not even part of the Geneva Convention. That's more of a balanced, that's more of a debatable issue. What Ukraine is doing is not debatable. It's a patent, complete violation of the Geneva Convention, and yet you got that nitwit Garland talking to the Ukrainian prosecutor, doing and orchestrating these illegal Geneva war crimes violations, about working together with her to encourage, incentivize, and do more of them, which shows what a sad, pitiful disgrace we have got to in the West as to matters of international law. And which that's only another manifestation. One of the other common questions was about Assange. I would ask Alexander about this because I don't know the full, like how much. My understanding is very limited appeal rights now, and it's just a matter of time, and that time is short for when he ends up in the United States. I can comment on the U.S. side after that.
I have to say I agree with that. By the way, can I just say I wholeheartedly agree with all your points about the Geneva Convention and about certainly the Ukraine has committed appalling crimes, far worse than the other side has done, and that's the reality. And of course, we are ignoring that reality in the West, and that's absolutely true. But just like yourself, I do not like people who find ways around the Geneva Conventions. I don't think at all that's what you should do. Anyway, but coming to Assange, right, he's now going to appeal against Liz Truss, not Liz Truss, sorry, Priti Patel's decision to deport him to the United States. And he's going to appeal to the High Court, and he's going to no doubt make many of the points about the decision of the lower court judge, District Judge Baritza, which said all the reasons she gave for agreeing that he should be deported to the United States. She refused the decision on, risk to his health, but unfortunately that has failed. He's now going to try and argue all the other points in the High Court. I have to say straightforwardly, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think it's going to take very long for the High Court to reject an appeal on that basis. I'm not even convinced that he's going to get permission to appeal, to be straightforward about it.
Right.
So
how quickly could he be sent to the U.S.?
I think it could be done within weeks. Now, he's got one advantage, which is that we're now in June, before very long, as in the United States. And I don't remember the times when this exactly starts, but we'll be in Britain in what's called the summer vacation. The High Court closes. They won't realistically decide this perhaps before, unless they rush through the decision now, which they might not decide to do. But realistically, September, October, they might come to a decision on whether to grant leave to appeal. I don't think they're going to grant leave to appeal. That's the whole drift of this case up to now. I'm afraid I think he's going to be sent to the United States. Now, From a humanitarian point of view, that is a terrible thing. From a political point of view, it's a disgrace for Britain. For Julian Assange, personally, and for the legal case, I've clearly come round to the view that he's going to have much more chance of winning in the United States before an American jury, even the most, selected jury, and defended under the rights of the Constitution by American lawyers. I think one of the fundamental problems is that in Britain, firstly, the whole process, it was clear, was deeply politicized and deeply controlled. But secondly, I think the British judiciary, sections of it, simply haven't understood some of the provisions of the US Constitution and why, under the US Constitution, Julian Assange has certain protections as a journalist. So I think he has much more rights, much more prospects of success in the United States than he does in Britain. He will have the Constitution working for him. He will have far better lawyers understanding how the Constitution works than he does in Britain. And I think, to be straightforward about it, I also think he will have more support from the public, because this is something that the American public, freedom of speech, freedom of the media, they care about that more. And there is a much, much bigger independent alternative media ecosystem in the United States than there is here in Britain. So I say all of this. I say this with great sorrow. I'm terribly sorry for Julian Assange. I feel deep shame that my country, Britain, has done what it has done. But I think that is the reality. I think he will be sent to the United States. I think perhaps September, October, unless it's, as I said, rushed through quickly, which I still don't think it will be. And I think, realistically, being completely realistic about it, his chances of success are greater here.
Yeah, I
mean, are greater than.
Yeah, I mean, at least on paper, this will be another test of the U.S. Constitutional criminal justice system in a politicized case, which in recent time we have mostly sadly failed to affirm the constitutional system. We're seeing it in the January 6 cases. Jury pool. We saw it in the lawyer caught red-handed, Sussman. No question that he was guilty. Overwhelming evidence that he was guilty, and the D.C. jury acquitted him. And they said, "Well, why later? This wasn't that important of a case, and this really shouldn't have been brought." And what they meant is that they hate Trump and they will pardon someone effectively through a jury acquittal. It was jury nullification, is what it was, because on the law he was guilty. They just nullified that, negated it, because they liked the fact he was anti-Trump. And that's but it made the DC criminal justice process look like a joke, just as all of the rubber stamp jury verdicts convicting one January 6 defendants on charges that judges are often saying are not even legally cognizable a crime, has made a further mockery of the January 6 process. And this follows everything since 2016, where a lot of Antifa people who committed a lot of crimes, the 2017 inauguration, and then you had the BLM incidents where they set D.C. half on fire in summer of 2020 and tried to have a real insurrection, attack the White House. None of those people were successfully convicted for the most part. Either prosecutors refused to investigate, grand juries refused to indict, or juries refused to convict. You have a jury pool that makes 1950s Birmingham look like a beacon of civil liberties, is what the D.C. jury pool does in 2020. And what the D.C. judges who are denying transfer motions to transfer these cases out of the District of Columbia to pick a real meaningful jury trial are equally embarrassed, or should be, by the what's happening. And so where Julian Assange will be prosecuted is is a federal district court in Virginia that does national security cases. And sadly, its history is horrible. A history of covering up evidence, a history of keeping evidence from the public, and evidence in the name of national security, of railroading a lot of whistleblowers, particularly in that district court. My view is that district court shouldn't have the degree of jurisdiction that it does. It's an abuse of its power. There's other judges in other courts and other courts of appeals that would look at a robust First Amendment challenge, which, as you know, Julian Assange absolutely has, This criminal prosecution violates the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, period. It is published. It is trying to prosecute him for publishing. They try to pretend in parts of the indictment that that's not what it's about. And my answer is always simple. If he had never published, would you be prosecuting him? The answer is nobody can say yes plausibly to that. They're trying to say, well, it's him talking to him in this way, him asking him to look at this, him da-da-da. By the way, that's commonplace in the media. Happens all the time. Everybody, New York Times onwards, asking, can you send us this? Can you send us this? Where was the prosecution when they illegally and criminally leaked Trump's tax returns to the New York Times? Where's that prosecution if we're going to suddenly start prosecuting the illegal disclosure of information or the publication of it? The whole Pentagon Papers case was about you can't have prior restraint of it. How can you have subsequent criminal prosecution of it? So now there's some bad case law out there in the United States that has tried to gut the meaning of the First Amendment in the national security criminal context, where we make all of our bad judicial exceptions to the law, all of our bad precedential exceptions to the First Amendment as national security. What national security was invoked here? Is there a national security interest in lying to the American people? Is there a national security interest in killing people and then trying to keep it a secret, killing it? Because that's what Julian Assange exposed war crimes of deep state apparatus and militaries around the world. That's what he did. He published some of the most important information to be published. My view, national security never justifies that. National security is not a green light to commit crimes and then to hide it. National security is about ongoing exigent interest in something that was lawfully done that could be lawfully done in the future. That's not what this is. That's not what the Pentagon Papers was about. Pentagon Papers was about the U.S. government lying for a decade to the American people. So enough is enough. And the Julian Assange is a hero of the free speech, a hero of the freedom of press, a hero of exposing war crimes, and it's an embarrassment that the United States government is considering prosecuting him. It was a great embarrassment of Trump that he didn't pardon him. He was about to pardon both him and Snowden, and he was told by Mitch McConnell he would be convicted and subject to criminal prosecution if he did. And Trump let the January 6th backlash scare him, and it never should have. But sadly, it did. By that point, he was very isolated. There was almost no allies around him. Sean Hannity, the ultimate traitor, the war whore in chief, the guy that likes to wear his little CIA thing, was telling, has now gone public. The information has gone public. He was telling Trump that he faced conviction and imminent risk. Hannity himself was a deeply anti-Assange, anti-Snowden guy. And so it was that wing that prevented Trump from pardoning him. It was also the Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Richard Grenell. People have wondered why I've critiqued Richard Grenell, because he was neck deep in getting getting Julian Assange removed from the Ecuadorian embassy. Pence went down to Ecuador, cut a deal, said we will help with the new Ecuadorian government deal with certain debt obligations of the Ecuadorian government in exchange for stealing Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy and bringing him here. So we have a lot of people complicit that covering up deep state crimes, some of the worst deep state crimes, by prosecuting and punishing a man for exposing it. And this isn't about Assange as much as it is punishing, scaring and terrifying anyone else from becoming another Julian Assange. That's what it's about. They want to. He's already served effectively 7 years in prison or more, if you count the time he's been locked up inside a tiny closet in the Ecuadorian embassy, particularly towards the end where he was badly treated, and then the way he's been treated in British custody since that time period. If the U.S. government had any conscience, they would offer him a deal to plead to something low and let him do time served and go home. At least end this horror of torturing a man on top of the illicit aspects of prosecuting him, indicting him, investigating him, trying to kill him as Hillary Clinton wanted in the first place. Julian Assange was a hero, is a hero, remains a hero, and our prosecution of him is an embarrassment and public shame on every politician connected to it. But he faces an uphill battle, unfortunately, in the United States, because our court systems are so politicized. They've shown an inability and incapacity to meaningfully enforce constitutional rights, because if they were, this criminal indictment would be dismissed on First Amendment grounds out of the gate.
Well, Robert, I agree with all the points you made about Assange and about the disgraceful nature of the case. I'm just going to make one point. You see, you said right at the beginning, would he have been prosecuted in the United States if he had not published? Now, that is a blindingly obvious point. I don't think a single British lawyer has made it. I haven't seen one. I mean, I didn't think of it. And that gives you the difference. That shows the difference between a culture, a political culture, which is that which exists in the United States, where you live the First Amendment. It's part of your constitution. It's part of your world. And us in Britain, where we don't have that. So I take all that you said about the deeply corrupted politicized nature of the judicial system in the United States, and this is indisputably true. And the Sussman decision was just extraordinary. And can I just also say, I mean, I looked at what his defense was, and I said to myself, "Is this a joke? I mean, is this actually a defense? I mean, it just didn't make any kind of sense as a defense." And yet, as you correctly said, he was acquitted. And I think that it was. I can't remember. I think somebody made the point. This is how Sussman's treated by a court in DC. Compare that with the way in which Michael Flynn was treated by a court in DC. I mean, was also charged with lying to the FBI, and in one case, the judge goes rogue and does ludicrous things against Michael Flynn, appalling things, and in another case where it's clear cut, the defendant walks. I mean, you're absolutely right. It is a deeply corrupted, deeply politicized system. But nonetheless, because you understand the First Amendment, you're able to make immediately an obvious point like that, which, as I said, I think in Britain was completely missed. Because it's absolutely, you're absolutely right. It clarifies the whole issue wonderfully.
Well, and one additional component, the U.S. government promised that that any sentence Assange served would be served in Australia to the courts in Britain. What is not commonly understood is the U.S. does not consider that binding unless it's inside the extradition document itself. Unless the extradition document itself says this extradition is only occurring on the condition that any sentence for it will be served in this particular way. The U.S. government has routinely made false promises to foreign governments that foreign governments have bought, but failed to codify in the extradition warrant itself. And if it's not in there, the U.S. government considers it non-binding entirely. So there's no guarantee that Assange ultimately serves his sentence in Australia. Because the U.S. government has repeatedly and routinely and flagrantly violated that. The British government, if they're honorable, will require that as a condition of his extradition in the document itself. My guess is they won't, because a lot of them are corrupt and in on it, sadly. But and that means that people that think Assange is protected on the sentencing side, he is not. The U.S. government routinely and flagrantly says those promises are non-binding on them. So they want him sent to Supermax. They want a message sent, you never be another Julian Assange, or this is what will happen to you. They're more terrified of publishing their illicit secrets than they are of anything else. It proves Assange is right. It's like without secrets, it's like the movie Sneakers, no more secrets. Without secrets, the illicit actions of the corrupt governments could not sustain themselves in an era of popular limitations on government. And so it's unfortunate, but I do hope he has the best counsel that makes the most robust defenses in the United States. Because that needs to happen. It must happen. His case is critical, not only for the First Amendment of himself, but in the First Amendment of those who care about it, but the First Amendment of everybody in the future. The government cannot get away with putting a man in prison for publishing its bad secrets. It's dirty laundry.
I totally agree. Robert, can I just say, you're absolutely on the issue of, American promises not to put him in a Supermax and to send him to Australia being worthless. Here I have to criticize Assange's lawyers. They didn't do their homework sufficiently on this. When they made their submissions to the High Court on this, I thought, and the Court of Appeal, they did it very weakly. I don't think they had really prepared. They really researched this. They brought up a number of very isolated cases. It wasn't properly explained to the court here. Of course, it was all done in a hurry. I mean, that's the other thing that was, really shocking about the legal process here. And in some ways it was very slow. In other cases, things were being sprung on Assange and his team, and they were given very little time to respond. But even allowing for that, they should have got proper advice from someone like yourself, and they should have come to the court in Britain, and they should have given verse, book, and chapter explaining why these American assurances aren't worth the paper that they're written on. Because what happened, and I was just reading all of this, and I was just absolutely, gobsmacked, as we say, is that the British High Court said, oh, of course, we can entirely rely on the United States, what it says, because, well, it's the United States. The United States always keeps its promises. And you have the prosecutor, he's asked at one point, is there any instance where the United States hasn't done what it promised? And the prosecutor, of course, says, oh, no, inconceivable. The Americans always do what they say they will do. There's never been a case when they have not. And of course, the reality is, as you absolutely rightly say, completely the opposite is really the case. One question I have to ask, let's say he loses. I think most people expect that he will lose. Let's say he loses before the first instance court in Virginia. I mean, does he have a route of appeal? And could it go all the way up to the Supreme Court? And would this Supreme Court actually entertain an appeal like that if it were to reach them?
So he has a right of appeal to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals that is presuming it's tried in Virginia. Fourth Circuit is a neoliberal dominated court currently, not real sensitive or sympathetic on defendant rights in general. I have a current case that I'm taking up to the U.S. Supreme Court after the Fourth Circuit ignored some egregious issues in a case that I handled the appeal for. So, and in studying it, it was clear that's where its current mindset is, very pro-prosecution. In general, the United States federal courts are really bad on criminal cases. The criminal conviction rate by juries in federal cases is over 80%, often approaches body temperature, like 96, 97, 98%. Historically, years ago, political scientists stumbled into this. They wanted an objective metric for measuring whether a country is totalitarian or not, and they came up with jury conviction rates and appeals affirmation rates as an example of whether a country is totalitarian. And so they studied primarily totalitarian countries, and they came up with numbers. And they're like, if you have a appeal conviction affirmation rate over 80% in criminal cases and over 90% or 85% in jury trial cases, then you're probably a totalitarian country. Well, guess what the American federal criminal justice process looks like? So a lot of good rules on paper, not so well enforced in court. Now, I have an appellate reversal rate and a jury acquittal rate of 50% or better in most areas of criminal law in the state and federal system. But that's an exception. And it comes from understanding the politics of the law, how to maneuver a case into a certain way to get the best chance. Now, this U.S. Supreme Court wouldn't have to take the case, but they could take the case. The problem is we have a Supreme Court that's really very pro-prosecutor, very pro-police. Like we have a split between the Supreme Court is 3-3-3. 3 liberals. Breyer stepping down. His replacement is likely to be more liberal than him and less of a corporate liberal. So it's 3 pretty strong liberals. 3 corporate centrist is what you could loosely call them. That's Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. They're not flame-throwing conservatives. The only thing they're expected to be good on is occasional limitations on federal governmental power in like areas of the Interstate Commerce Clause, things like that. And in areas like religious rights, religious protection, because they're all religious conservatives, but not in what I would call populist areas of law, limiting the power of the government on vaccine mandates, limiting the power of the government. They had a decent decision, but not a great decision so far in the vaccine mandate context as one illustration. Didn't interfere in the elections. Classic example of that, being very centrist, corporatist. They love prosecutorial power so much and want to limit the ability of the people to restrain governmental abuse, that they just ruled that that if the federal government law enforcement employee violates a bunch of your constitutional rights, you can't sue them. So they just did that about 3 weeks ago. So it's called Bivens here in America. But that gives you a sense of their mindset. Then you have the three populist or populist-oriented originalist conservatives, but more oriented. Thomas, Gorsuch, and Alito. The problem is none of them are very sympathetic on criminal defendant rights. So in the criminal defendant context, you have one or two liberals that are occasionally sympathetic, but they're on the neoliberal side, so not likely to side with Assange. So the problem is the Supreme Court might take the case because of its constitutional consequence and the great public attention on it, because the question is there limitations on the prosecutorial power of the federal government to punish a member of the press for printing the dirty laundry of that government? Common sense says the First Amendment says you can't do it. Whether they carve out exceptions and loopholes will be the attention will be the issue. The intellectual component of the issue is more likely to get their attention than sympathy with Assange. So there's a chance. Also, if Trump wins in 2025, I think he will revisit and ultimately pardon Assange. I think he will do it combined with the January 6th defendants to give him some political coverage. A bunch of us thought he was going to do it. The closest people to Trump, the most loyal people to Trump inside the White House, all wrote a memo that I was part of saying to pardon Julian Assange. And he was close to doing it. And but for the extortionate threats by Mitch McConnell, who's now, by the way, such a permanent Trump enemy, Trump attacks him in almost every speech. He's practicing nicknames for him. So it's good. That's going to escalate. Once Trump sells on a nickname, it will be bam, 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 bam. So I think because of Mitch McConnell's involvement in not letting Assange get pardoned, that increases the chance that if Trump wins in 2025, Julian Assange, along with all the January 6th defendants, will be pardoned in mass. I hope he adds Snowden's name to that list. But that will be for some of us to try to push through. He was much closer than people know. But for January 6th, he would have pardoned Julian Assange and Snowden. That was the majority sentiment. Pompeo was lobbying like mad against it. Sean Hannity was lobbying like mad. Those guys, a bunch of us told Trump and Trump's people, Mike Pompeo was a traitor. Mike Pence was a traitor. Sean Hannity was a traitor. Trump, to be honest, didn't listen. Now he knows, he already thinks this himself about Mike Pence. He now increasingly thinks it about Sean Hannity and thinks it about Mike Pompeo, because Pompeo yipped way too much to some writers and reporters, and they're writing about, Barr was bragging about how how Pompeo could distract Trump from any defense policy issue by talking about Russiagate. Say, oh, it's so terrible, and so they made fun of Trump behind Trump's back about how they could easily manipulate him. Pompeo wants to run in 2024, by the way. He plans on being a primary candidate. He will get obliterated in the race, especially if he's dumb enough to go up against Trump. Trump will punish. So I think the ultimate ending for Julian Assange, 80% chance of it, if Trump wins in 2024, is that Julian Assange will be pardoned in 2025. But they need to continue to highlight his case, continue to pursue the First Amendment aspects of his case. The other mistake, to your point, Alexander, about the British lawyers, I'd encourage them not to be obsessively anti-Trump.
A lot of people have said this.
They hurt Assange by doing that.
Absolutely. Can I just say, in fact, that again, I can say that lots of warnings were given that this is a big mistake, that this is actually going to play very badly. And of course, it was disregarded. And I don't know quite why or for what reason. Maybe it was playing to the British gallery because, of course, Donald Trump was not very popular in Britain because the media made sure that he wouldn't be. So, but I think it was a terrible mistake. I think it was also, I think it didn't cut any ice with the court. Of course, the moment Trump ceased to be president, we saw that it was nothing to do with Trump anyway, that it was absolutely pushed by forces that had nothing to do with Donald Trump at all. And by the way, I'm very skeptical about the story that Barack Obama and his people didn't really want a prosecution of Julian Assange. I've heard this, this is constantly trotted out. It was constantly trotted out by the lawyers here in Britain. There's never any very strong evidence of that. It was all media stories. And it seems to me there's a classic example of Barack Obama wanting to be both, run with the hare and run with the hounds, as we say in Britain. On the one hand, he was probably, would have been only too delighted to do what the deep state wanted. But on the other hand, he was also very careful to appear, that he was the great liberal who wouldn't obviously go against Julian Assange and, encroach on First Amendment and media rights. But anyway, that I think, I've been supportive of the British lawyers overall. I think they had a very difficult case to fight. That doesn't mean that they didn't make some serious mistakes. And that one was certainly a very, very serious mistake. And I know it was pointed out to them.
And in the States, Assange needs to focus. It needs to be Trumpish people that are aligned with his court of public opinion fight.
Yeah.
He will get no mercy from the Democratic side. It just ain't happening. Because as to your point, like when people kept talking about Barack Obama, I'd say, tell me the president who has prosecuted more whistleblowers in his term than all presidents before him combined. And his name is Barack Hussein Obama. Barack Obama, I always used to say Barack may have got some of his political ideas in Indonesia, but he got his political strategy from Chicago. And just watch TV shows like The Boss. He was going to love the surveillance state and be enraged at anyone exposing it. That's why he hated Snowden so much. Snowden was Snowden because Assange, he figured out that Obama was a fraud. So if the people here that are on the anti-war left, anti-establishment left, anti-security state left, that think that being anti-Trump is good for Assange in the domestic United States, they're wrong. The only potential source of support Assange will get for a pardon or a commutation, or even in the federal court process, will come from Trumpish judges. Nobody on the left will come to his political protection. Just as none of them voted against the Ukrainian financial package, 40 billion plus, there won't be any institutional liberal support, sadly, for Julian Assange. Hopefully they play it better politically here than they did in the UK.
I hope so. I absolutely hope so. I do hope he gets a very good legal team. And can I just also say something else about Assange? And I know that sometimes what we say does get back to him. Please don't meddle in your case. He does so apparently quite a lot. And it has created problems for his lawyers from time to time, especially if you get to the United States. It's a different jurisdiction. You don't know it so well. Follow the advice. Get yourself good lawyers. You can get advice. You've got all kinds of people who will be prepared to help you in the United States, and work with your legal team. Don't try and second guess them. My friends, this has been one of the most amazing and stimulating discussions, but I'm afraid
we're on almost on 3.5 hours.
Half hours,
and this was the flow of this entire stream was near perfect.
Absolutely,
it really flowed well.
Absolutely, but
fantastic.
So let's call it a day, an afternoon, an evening, wherever you are in the world. Once again, the great Robert Barnes, where can people find you?
Everything that's useful, also exclusive content, also content you can exclusively create yourself. VivaBarnesLaw.locals.com.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Robert Barnes, for joining us on this awesome live stream. Thank you to everyone on Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, and Locals, and all the super chat questions and all the questions on Rumble and Odyssey and Locals. We will put together a dedicated video for those questions as well, whatever we didn't get to in this live stream. Good night, everybody. Take care. And thank you to our moderators. Thank you to all our moderators. Take care.